Have you ever wondered how a city can simply grow quiet, as if the world slowly decided to leave it behind? Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we will move gently through the story of lost cities, those places where streets, homes, temples, markets and harbors once held the full rhythm of daily life. Some were buried by sand, some were swallowed by forest, some were abandoned after war, drought, disease or shifting trade, and some have only fragments left to guide us now. Yet even in their ruins, they still speak softly. If you enjoy these calm journeys through history, you are always welcome to like the video, subscribe, or leave a quiet comment about where you are listening from tonight, or what ancient subject you might like to explore next. There is no hurry at all, just a gentle invitation. Settle in wherever you are most comfortable. Let the room become dim and still. Let the day loosen its grip a little. And as we begin, imagine dust in sunlight, stone worn smooth by many footsteps, and the long patience of time. Now we can begin with the first of these quiet places and slowly let each one appear, one by one, like lanterns in the dark. A lost city is rarely lost in exactly the same way twice. In some cases, it is buried by mud, sand, volcanic ash, or thick growth that slowly covers every wall and street. In others, it is lost to memory, its name lingering in old inscriptions, travelers' notes, or half-remembered traditions, while the buildings themselves collapse into rubble. And sometimes a city is not truly lost at all to the people who live nearby. It is only lost to outside scholars, who arrive much later and rediscover a place that local communities had never entirely forgotten. That is one of the quiet lessons of archaeology. Disappearance is often a matter of perspective. A place can remain alive in stories, rituals, and family history long after maps have stopped naming it. Many of the world's most famous lost cities were not empty when they were abandoned. They were once full of homes with cooking hearths, storage jars, wells, workshops, courtyards, shrines, and narrow lanes where daily life moved at an ordinary pace. Children ran through them. Markets opened there in the morning. Smoke rose from kitchens. People repaired tools, swept thresholds, and carried water in clay vessels that now lie broken in the earth. When people leave, a city does not vanish all at once. It lingers in fragments, in walls standing chest-high, in soot darkening a beam, in a scatter of pottery shards, in the shape of a road worn by feet long gone. Those small traces become clues, and from them scholars slowly reconstruct a lost way of living. The phrase lost city can also be misleadingly romantic. It suggests a single dramatic moment, as though a city simply disappeared overnight into mist or sand. In truth, most disappearances are gradual. A river changes course, a harbor silts up, a trade route shifts, a ruler falls, a drought stretches across years, then decades. Crops grow less reliable. Families move away little by little, first for opportunity, then for necessity. By the time a place is fully empty, the leaving has often been underway for generations. What remains is silence, but a silence with a long history inside it. Some lost cities were great capitals, centers of power and ceremony, while others were modest towns built around farming, craft, or local trade. Yet both kinds can be equally important. The smaller places often preserve the textures of everyday life more clearly than grand imperial centers do. A royal capital may leave inscriptions and monumental walls, but a smaller settlement may preserve kitchen floors, domestic courtyards, and workspaces where people made bread, repaired nets, or stored grain. These details help historians understand not only rulers and elites, but ordinary families and the rhythms of common life. One of the oldest reasons cities disappear is environmental change. In some regions, rivers flood in different patterns, harbors gradually fill with sediment, wells run low, or farmland becomes less dependable. A city built on a fertile edge may slowly find itself on harsher ground. What once felt secure begins to feel difficult. Water has to be carried farther, fields yield less, travel takes longer. Over time, households drift toward better conditions and the old city is left behind. What remains may be a shell of brick, stone and broken plaster slowly reclaimed by wind, roots and time. This is why lost cities are not only stories about ruins, they are also stories about adaptation. People are constantly responding to weather, geography and uncertainty. A city may have seemed permanent to its residents, yet it was always resting on a landscape that could change. Even powerful societies are vulnerable to shifts in climate, erosion and water supply. The quiet erosion of habit and habitability can matter as much as war or collapse. Sometimes the most important question is not why a city fell, but how long people were able to keep adjusting before leaving became the wiser choice. Archaeologists often begin with one small clue. It might be a pot fragment on the surface, a line in a dusty archive, a wall visible from above in a crop pattern, a mound that looks natural but is not, or a place name echoed in old documents and oral traditions. Then the careful work begins. There are measurements, trenches, notes, photographs, maps, and layers of soil to interpret. Discovery is usually slow and methodical. It is not often a single thrilling moment, but many quiet steps taken with patience. The most important finds are frequently the least dramatic at first glance. A broken seal, a house foundation, a cooking pit, a worn staircase, a buried street. Each one adds a little more shape to a vanished city. There is also something emotionally powerful about a lost city because it compresses time. A visitor can stand among stones that once held up roofs, framed courtyards and sheltered families, and feel how quickly the ordinary world becomes ancient. The feeling is not only mystery, it is continuity. The people who lived there were not distant symbols. They were parents, children, merchants, scribes, builders, farmers, and neighbors. They worried about food, weather, work, illness, and the future, just as people do now. In that sense, a lost city can feel less like a remote puzzle and more like a close echo. That gentle human truth will stay with us throughout tonight's journey, because the most haunting part of a lost city is often how familiar it feels beneath the ruin. The stones are old, but the lives that once moved through them were recognizably human. Some lost cities are found through legend, but legend alone is rarely enough. Stories can preserve a name, a river, a mountain, a foreign ruler, or a royal line, but the physical place still has to be confirmed by evidence. When that happens, myth and archaeology begin a careful conversation. Sometimes the story is exaggerated, sometimes it is compressed. Sometimes it keeps a memory of a real place in a form that has changed over centuries. The tale may not be exact, but it can still be meaningful. Folklore often acts like a lantern carried through darkness, not bright enough to reveal everything, but enough to point toward the path. That is part of the enduring fascination of lost cities. They sit between imagination and record, between what survived and what did not. They remind us that history is not a perfectly kept archive. It is a field of fragments. A fragmentary inscription, a damaged statue, a half-erased road, a broken jar in packed earth. These are the pieces from which whole neighborhoods are rebuilt in the mind. Scholars must work gently with uncertainty, because in archaeology the absence of evidence is also evidence of sorts. It can suggest collapse, reuse, removal, flooding, erosion, or simply the limits of what has survived. A city may also be lost because the name we use for it is not the one its people used. Names change across languages, dynasties, and centuries. A capital known in one era may be renamed under a new ruler. A sacred site may carry several names depending on who is speaking. A place recorded in an ancient text may survive in foreign chronicles under a slightly altered sound. Sometimes one city appears to be many places until the names are untangled. Other times, several ancient names seem to point to one buried settlement. When modern scholars speak of rediscovery, they are often not only finding stones, but tracing a long chain of naming, translation, and memory. Some cities were abandoned after conquest, when power shifted to a different center. Armies might have damaged walls, temples, and storage systems, but abandonment was often more complicated than simple destruction. Administration moved elsewhere. Taxes were redirected. Elites relocated. trade followed new routes. After that, ordinary residents sometimes stayed as long as they could, adapting to a city that no longer had the same importance. Eventually, the living fabric thinned. In many ancient societies, few cities had the luxury of permanence. Their survival depended on water, labor, politics, and exchange. If one pillar failed, the whole structure could gradually weaken until only a husk remained. Others were left after earthquakes, fires, disease, or repeated shortages. A disaster might not empty a city in a single day, but it could make rebuilding too difficult or too costly. In some places, surviving elsewhere was simply easier than beginning again. A settlement on the coast might suffer storms and erosion. A hilltop city might lose access to its farms. A lowland town might face disease in stagnant water. The reasons for abandonment are often practical, even when the outcome feels dramatic in hindsight. Human communities tend to stay as long as staying is possible. When they leave, there is usually a chain of pressures behind that decision. Tonight, as we continue, it helps to think of these places not as dead sites, but as pauses in a very long story. Their quiet is real, but so is the life that once filled them. The people who built them did not know they were making ruins. They were making homes, markets, sanctuaries, and streets for the present they inhabited. That is part of the tenderness of studying lost cities. We are always looking at the past through the remains of someone else's ordinary day. Sometimes a lost city is preserved almost by accident. A flood deposits a layer of silt and protects what lies beneath. A volcanic eruption seals a town in ash, and ash preserves what fire destroys. Sand drifts over walls and keeps them hidden from later building. In some dry climates, even fragile materials like wood, cloth, and reed can survive longer than expected. Preservation and destruction can be strangely intertwined. What ruins a city in one moment can also shelter it for centuries. The earth does not simply erase, it also keeps. In other cases, a city becomes lost because later people reuse its stones, walls, or foundations. Temples turn into quarries. Houses become sources of brick. Roads are paved over or widened. A new settlement grows from the old one, layer by layer. The original city is not gone so much as absorbed. This can make archaeology especially delicate, because the past is not always buried untouched. Sometimes it has been mined, recycled, and built upon by those who came later. Even then, traces remain in foundations, buried rooms, or the alignment of streets that still follow ancient lines. Oral tradition can be important too. In many places, elders, local historians, and community stories preserve knowledge that written records do not. A mound may have a name. A ruin may be associated with a king, a saint, a flood, or a forgotten migration. Not every tradition is historically precise, but it can still point toward meaningful memory. Archaeologists and historians often learn most when they listen carefully to local accounts rather than assuming the landscape is silent. Sometimes the people living near a site are the first to explain how it should be understood. And in the end, one of the most striking things about lost cities is that they are never only about loss. They are about change, survival, rediscovery, and the ways human beings leave marks on the world even when their names fade. A city can vanish from political history and still remain in the body of the land. Its streets can be hidden, but its shape can still guide the eye. Its houses can collapse, but the pattern of daily life can be read in the soil. Its stories can soften with time, but they do not disappear entirely. So tonight, as we move through these quiet places, imagine them not as empty spaces, but as layers of presence. Imagine the sound of footsteps in a marketplace now covered by grass. Imagine lamps lit in rooms whose walls have fallen. Imagine voices carried across courtyards where only wind passes now. The lost city is never only lost. It is waiting in one form or another to be remembered. One of the most famous lost cities in the modern imagination is Petra, carved into the rose-colored cliffs of what is now Jordan. Yet Petra was never truly forgotten by the local Bedouin, who knew the area long before European travelers described it in detail. This is a pattern that appears often in the history of rediscovery. A place may be newly introduced to some audiences while remaining familiar to others. Petra's carved facades, tombs, and water channels reveal a city shaped by engineering as much as by artistry. The Nabateans understood how to collect and guide scarce desert water, and that practical skill helped make the city possible. In the stillness of the canyon approaches, it is easy to imagine the ancient balance between beauty and necessity. The famous monuments are only the most visible part of a much larger system of survival, one that depended on careful routes, hidden reservoirs, and the patient management of every drop. Cities in dry regions often depended on precise water systems. Channels, cisterns, dams, and conduits were not background features, they were the foundation of life. In places like Petra, survival meant turning rainfall into storage. That is one reason lost desert cities are so revealing. Their remains show not only beauty but careful adaptation. The stone facades that photograph so well are only a visible surface. Beneath them lies an infrastructure of survival. A visitor may first notice the color of the cliffs or the elegance of a doorway cut into rock, but an archaeologist may look instead for the traces of runoff, the slope of a channel, or the position of a cistern carved where water would linger. In dry lands, architecture and hydrology often become one and the same, and the city teaches us that endurance can be as graceful as ornament. Another city often associated with loss is Palmyra, once a flourishing center between major empires. Palmyra's location helped it thrive as a trade hub, linking caravan routes across the desert. Trade cities are especially vulnerable to change. If routes shift, if political control changes, or if a safer harbor or road appears elsewhere, commerce can fade surprisingly quickly. Buildings remain, but the pulse of exchange slows. Palmyra sat in a landscape that seems empty to the modern eye, yet for centuries it stood at a busy meeting point of languages, goods, and customs. Caravans moved through with spices, textiles, glass, and ideas, and the city's columns and colonnades still suggest that once grand rhythm. Even in ruin, it can feel as if the city is waiting for the sound of hoofbeats or the rustle of bundles being unloaded in the heat of evening. Many lost cities owe their survival to aridity. Desert climates can preserve plaster, wood, textiles, and even food remains far better than damp regions. That is why some of the most vivid glimpses into ancient life come from dry places. A city that seems empty from a distance may still hold colors, tools, writing, and domestic objects in astonishing condition. In some cases, a sealed room can preserve the texture of a woven mat, the shape of a clay vessel, or faint pigment on a wall. Such survivals are quietly astonishing because they narrow the distance between present and past. Instead of a general idea of ancient life, scholars can study the ordinary details: a comb, a bead, a seed, a piece of rope. These objects do not always shout their importance, but together they can rebuild a world with remarkable tenderness. There is a quiet paradox here. The same dryness that threatens human life can also preserve its traces. Sand can bury a street, but it can also seal it from erosion. In that way, the desert is both destroyer and guardian. Wind may strip away loose surfaces, and heat may make life difficult for any settlement, but over long periods, arid conditions can keep collapse from becoming total loss. A wall fallen into sand may still keep its outline. A room closed by dust may remain legible long after roof beams have vanished. This is one reason desert archaeology often feels like gentle uncovering rather than dramatic recovery. The work is slow, and the place seems to allow for a while the return of what time had covered. The rediscovery of a lost city can begin with a glimpse from the air. Shadows, crop marks, color changes in soil, or unnatural mounds may reveal structures invisible from the ground. Modern survey methods have transformed archaeology, allowing researchers to see patterns across landscapes that once seemed blank. Satellite imagery, drone photography, and ground-penetrating radar have all become important tools in finding hidden urban remains. What once required chance, rumor, or patient walking now can begin with a digital image studied at a desk. Yet the image is only an invitation. It suggests that something lies below, but it does not tell the full story. The ground still has to be approached carefully because every city is more than its outline. Its history also lives in depth, in layers, in disturbed soil, in the long sequence of repairs and reuse that a picture from above cannot fully capture. Yet technology does not replace patience. A survey might suggest a city's outline, but excavation still requires time, care, and context. Every layer removed must be documented. A broken floor, a threshold, a hearth, or a drain can tell a more important story than a spectacular object. The city is understood not by one treasure, but by relationships among many small details. The slow labor of excavation often feels almost meditative. Brushes move softly across stone, measurements are taken, drawings are made, and every fragment is placed in relation to the whole. A single shard might show what a pot looked like, but the position of that shard may reveal where people cooked, stored, or gathered. In this way, archaeology listens as much as it looks. The lost city becomes a record not only of grandeur, but of daily habits repeated over generations. Some desert cities were crossroads of faith as well as trade. Temples, shrines, and burial spaces show how communities understood the boundary between the living and the dead. In such places, the sacred and the practical were often close together. A market could stand near a sanctuary, and a residence could overlook a tomb. Modern visitors sometimes separate these things in their minds, but ancient cities often held them side by side. That closeness can seem surprising at first, yet it reflects a worldview in which life was woven through with ritual, memory, and obligation. A road could lead past a sacred enclosure, and a place of commerce might also be a place of offering. In the dim light of an excavation trench, these overlaps become visible again, reminding us that ancient urban life was not divided into neat categories. It was lived as a continuous fabric. There is also a lesson in how fragile visibility can be. A structure buried for centuries may reappear suddenly after a storm, a shift in dunes, or a new survey. To one generation it seems gone, to another it is newly present. The city does not change as much as our access to it does. This is part of the strange rhythm of archaeology: long invisibility, then brief revelation. A mound that looked natural may prove to be a wall. A patch of grass may conceal a street. Rain can sometimes expose what wind has hidden, while human development can unexpectedly reveal foundations during construction. The moment of rediscovery is often less dramatic than it sounds, more like recognition than rescue. Yet it can still feel profound, because it reminds us that absence is sometimes only a matter of perspective and time. That is part of the calm beauty of this subject. Lost cities invite us to notice how much of history lies just beneath the surface, waiting for the right light. They suggest that the past is not entirely gone, but layered, quiet, and patient. The name itself, Lost City, has a poetic force, yet many such places were never truly erased. They were forgotten by some, remembered by others, and obscured by terrain, vegetation, sand, or changing political borders. In that sense, discovery is often a shared process between memory and research. A place emerges when fragments of oral tradition, old maps, aerial images, and careful fieldwork begin to align. The resulting picture is never complete, but it is enough to bring a city back into conversation with the present. In the case of Machu Picchu, the phrase lost city is used more carefully. The site was not entirely forgotten by local people, and its rediscovery in the early 20th century brought global attention to a place that had remained remote rather than entirely vanished. Still, the mountain setting gives it a powerful sense of seclusion. Mist, stone terraces, and steep slopes make the site feel like a city lifted into the clouds. The approach itself has a quiet drama. Cloud forest can soften the edges of the stone, and morning fog may turn stairways into pale lines that seem to appear slowly out of air. The place has become familiar through photographs, Yet in person it retains a feeling of remoteness, as though the mountains still keep part of their secret. Highland cities often had to master different challenges from desert ones. Instead of storing scarce water against drought, they managed rain, terraces, drainage, and steep transport routes. Building upward on mountainsides demanded labor and planning, and in return the setting could offer defense, visibility, and symbolic power. The slopes had to be shaped to suit human use without losing stability. Water had to be guided away from structures as carefully as it was brought to fields. The result was not simply a settlement perched on a peak, but a living landscape designed for balance. In such places, engineering becomes almost invisible because it is folded into the contours of the terrain. The eye sees beauty, but the ground itself reveals an intricate knowledge of soil, slope, and season. Terraces are especially graceful features. They show how ancient builders shaped the land rather than simply occupying it. Agricultural terraces prevented erosion and extended farmland into difficult terrain. Their lines also give lost cities a visual softness, as though the landscape itself were being taught to hold human life gently. From a distance, they resemble steps laid by the mountain for the sky. Up close, they reveal walls of fitted stone, packed earth, and careful drainage. They are practical structures, but they also create a sense of order that feels almost musical. Level by level, they transform a steep hillside into a place where crops can grow, and where human settlement can continue without forcing the mountain into a flatness it never had. One of the reasons Machu Picchu captures the imagination is that it feels both engineered and natural. The stone walls fit carefully, yet the mountains remain dominant. That balance is part of what makes many lost cities memorable. They do not always seem conquered by civilization. Instead, they suggest a negotiation between people and place. The most enduring sites often look as though they were made in conversation with the land, respecting its shape even while transforming it. This is one reason the ruins can feel so restful to the mind. They do not present human power as absolute. They present it as attentive, bounded, and responsive. The stones hold their lines, but the ridges, clouds, and valleys still lead the experience. This same pattern appears in other Andean sites, where roads, storehouses, and ceremonial spaces connected wider networks. Cities in these regions were not isolated jewels. They were nodes in a web of movement and administration. Their remoteness today can obscure how connected they once were. Paths linked highland settlements to valleys, to agricultural zones, and to ceremonial centers. Supply systems moved food, textiles, and labor across distances that would be challenging even now. Storehouses were not merely extra buildings. They were part of an organized economy that could support ritual, travel, and seasonal needs. The landscape that appears solitary today may once have been busy with officials, messengers, farmers, and pilgrims moving along stone roads under bright mountain light. In many mountain sites, the surviving architecture tells us about labor organization. Stones were cut, moved, fitted, and maintained through collective effort. A city is not only a place to live, it is a record of cooperation repeated over years. To raise a wall on a steep slope, people had to coordinate extraction, transport, placement, and repair. They had to know which stones could bear weight, which surfaces needed smoothing, and how to keep runoff from weakening the foundations. Such work implies systems of planning that are not always visible in the finished structures. The beauty of the ruins can make the labor invisible, but it is still there in every edge, joint, and terrace. The quiet precision of the masonry is itself a kind of archive. When modern travelers stand among high-altitude ruins, they often experience a silence that feels almost physical. The wind moves through doorways and terraces, and the mountain seems to preserve the scale of the past. Such places can feel suspended between world and sky, between daily work and ceremony. The thin air, the distant ridgelines, and the open exposure can make sound seem softer, as though the site itself is listening. It is easy in such moments to imagine the ordinary life that once passed through these spaces. Footsteps on stone, cloth moving in the breeze, voices carrying briefly and then fading. The ruin becomes less like an ending and more like a pause, a held breath in the long story of a city. That feeling, too, is part of what makes lost cities so enduring in the mind. They are not merely absent, they are present in fragments, in elevations, in weather, and in memory. Their stones may be broken, but their arrangement still speaks. Their streets may be empty, but their geometry still guides the eye. Whether buried in sand or lifted above clouds, these places remind us that human settlement has always depended on adaptation, patience, and a close relationship with the land. Even now, long after their busiest days have passed, they remain quietly instructive. Some lost cities are hidden not by sand or mountain mist, but by water. Floodplains, river valleys, and coastal zones have always been attractive places to build because they offer transport, fertile soil, and easy access to trade. Yet these are also landscapes that change over long spans of time. Rivers shift their channels, coastlines advance and retreat. Mud, silt, and fine sediment slowly settle over former streets, softening the outlines of walls and roads until a city that once stood in plain view is altered beyond recognition. What had been beside a lively waterway may eventually seem inland, underwater, or simply buried beneath layers of alluvium. Underwater archaeology has opened a slower, quieter kind of discovery. Instead of dry dust and excavation trenches, researchers may work with sonar, diving surveys, sediment cores, and careful mapping of submerged remains. Sunken harbours, stone blocks, jetties, and road surfaces can reveal how ancient cities once met the sea or river. In some places, districts slipped beneath the water because of earthquakes. In others, the ground sank gradually through subsidence, or the shoreline rose around the settlement as sea levels changed. The evidence is often delicate, and every measurement has to be made with patience. The famous examples of underwater cities often attract stories of sudden catastrophe, but the reality is usually more measured. Land can sink little by little. A harbour can be abandoned as silt builds up. A coastal settlement can be outpaced by shoreline change. The city is not always destroyed in one moment. Often it is simply no longer in the right place for the life it once served. The people move their attention elsewhere, and the old centre begins to lose its reason for being. Ports are particularly vulnerable because they depend on geography that stays usable. If access to open water declines, trade declines with it. Warehouses empty, artisans depart, and administrative buildings lose purpose. A harbour city can fade while the stonework still stands. A quay may remain in place long after ships can no longer reach it. Market streets may still be laid out in orderly lines, but without traffic they feel strangely paused, as if waiting for business that never returns. There is also a special intimacy to submerged remains. Water changes the texture of visibility. Stone becomes soft in the eye, and straight lines seem to drift. Marine growth, sediment, and moving currents make the site look dreamlike, almost half-remembered. That atmosphere encourages legend, especially where local stories speak of bells heard underwater or palaces sleeping beneath the waves. Yet the work of archaeologists remains concrete and careful. They record what is there, what is missing, and what the site can genuinely support. In coastal regions, storms can rearrange the ground dramatically. A single severe event may cover a settlement in sand, break walls, or wash away critical structures. Yet even then, the cause of abandonment may have begun long before the storm itself. A weak political system, declining trade, repeated flooding, or failing infrastructure can make a city vulnerable when the final event arrives. What looks sudden from a distance may actually be the last visible step in a much longer decline. This long chain of causes matters because it reminds us that lost cities rarely vanish from one dramatic blow. They are usually the product of many pressures gathering quietly over time. Water, weather, economics, and politics all act together. The last event only seals a process already underway. In that sense, a city may be lost before it is buried, because it has already ceased to function as the place people once depended on. Another category of lost city is the ceremonial or ritual center that becomes less relevant after belief systems shift. When rulers change, gods are renamed, calendars are revised, or pilgrimage routes alter, sacred places may no longer receive maintenance. Stone courtyards, processional ways, and shrines can fall into silence not because they were unimportant, but because they belong to a particular world that no longer existed in the same form. The buildings remain, but their meaning becomes harder to recover. Some such sites survive as pilgrimage destinations for later communities in altered ways. A former temple district might become a place of local reverence, seasonal gathering, or simple curiosity. Others become ruins, visited only by animals, winds, and the occasional traveler. In both cases, the landscape retains a memory of ceremony. A platform, altar, stairway, or alignment may outlast the theology that gave it meaning. The stones continue to point in directions that once mattered deeply. It is often tempting to imagine ancient cities as purely practical, but many were organized around movement, ritual, and cosmology. Streets could align with sacred features. Gates might frame celestial events. Public space could reflect the order people believed governed the universe. A city was not only a machine for living, it was also a map of values, carefully arranged so that daily life and sacred order could meet in the same place. That means a lost city is not just a place where people lived. It is also a place where they understood the world. The stones carry both administration and meaning. A drain cut through a floor can be as revealing as an altar, because both speak to how people thought about necessity, purity, and the proper arrangement of life. Even ordinary architecture can hold an idea of the cosmos. In some places, the abandonment of a city is tied to conquest and war. Military defeat can scatter populations and redirect power, yet even after violence, the leaving may remain gradual. Occupants may flee during instability, return briefly, then depart permanently when protection fails. A city may burn, but its loss is still often a process rather than a moment. Political authority can unravel slowly, and once it does, workshops close, markets thin out, and families seek safer ground. Modern historians approach such places with caution. They separate rumor from evidence, treasure tales from excavation records, and romantic images from material truth. That careful approach is important because lost cities have often been wrapped in exaggerated stories. Some have been claimed as impossible palaces, hidden capitals, or sites of miraculous disappearance. The real remains are usually more interesting than the legend anyway, because they show how actual people solved ordinary problems in difficult circumstances. Their worn floors and repaired walls are quieter than myth but more trustworthy. And so whether a city lies beneath water, sand, or memory, its silence is never empty. It is full of traces waiting to be read. A broken column, a collapsed dock, a pottery shard, or a line of foundation stones may seem modest, but together they form a careful record of human settlement. The lost city does not speak in a single voice. It speaks in fragments, and that is enough for patient listening. One of the quiet wonders of lost city research is how often daily life survives in the archaeological record. A child's toy, a cooking pot, a loom weight, a worn step, or a repaired wall can be more revealing than a royal monument. Great cities are often remembered for palaces and temples, but the ordinary neighborhoods tell us how the city truly functioned. They show where food was prepared, where cloth was made, where water was stored, and where families repeated the habits of daily survival. These domestic remains can show family size, diet, craft production, and social organization. The way a room was arranged might indicate storage, sleeping, or work. A cluster of grinding stones might suggest food preparation. A series of reused bricks might reveal thrift, adaptation, or scarcity. A soot-darkened ceiling can hint at cooking fires that burned through many evenings. Each small detail becomes part of a slow reconstruction, one that is built from patience rather than certainty. In some lost cities, the surviving streets are narrow and irregular. That can tell us that the city grew over time rather than being planned all at once. In others, wide avenues and repeated blocks suggest deliberate urban design. Both patterns are instructive. A city can be shaped by slow accumulation or by centralized authority, and often by both. Over generations, families add rooms, public officials widen roads, and builders adapt to what already exists. The city becomes a layered record of decisions made at different speeds. The physical texture of a site is important. Worn stone corners, wheel ruts, plaster fragments, drainage channels, and threshold marks all contribute to a fuller sense of place. Archaeologists read these features almost like sentences. The city is not seen in one glance. It is translated. This translation is never perfect, but it can be remarkably vivid when the remains are preserved well enough to follow. There is also a quiet humility in excavating domestic space. It reminds researchers that history is made not only by rulers and architects, but by people carrying water, cooking meals, repairing roofs, and sweeping thresholds. Lost cities preserve those humble acts if one knows where to look. A chipped bowl may show repeated use. A patched floor may show years of care. Such things are small, but they are often what made the city endure as long as it did. Sometimes the most evocative remains are not even walls, but voids. The shape of a vanished staircase, the impression of a roof beam, or the outline of a courtyard can suggest structures no longer standing. Absence becomes evidence. What is missing can be as informative as what survives. The empty space of a room can suggest the size of a family, the height of a roof, or the movement of air through a building. Even brokenness has a pattern. This is one reason lost cities are so useful to scholarship. They preserve not a polished version of the past, but a partial one. That partiality forces careful interpretation and leaves room for uncertainty. The result is often more honest and more moving than a complete story would be. A city that survives only in fragments asks the scholar to be patient and asks the listener to accept that some details will remain softly unresolved. Across the ancient world, trade helped many cities rise and fall. A city on a caravan route, a river junction, or a crossroads of maritime exchange could become wealthy very quickly. Merchants brought not only goods, but languages, beliefs, artistic styles, and technologies. Lost cities often reveal this mixture in pottery, inscriptions, imported materials, and architectural influences. A single market street can contain evidence of many regions meeting in one place. Trade cities are especially cosmopolitan. Even in times long before modern globalization, people moved with astonishing reach. A bead, a coin, a fabric dye, or a style of ornament might travel hundreds or thousands of miles. The city became a meeting point of distant worlds. You can sometimes feel that openness in the objects themselves. A local vessel made in a foreign shape, or a local wall built with methods learned elsewhere. Such places were never isolated for long, but this same interconnectedness could make a city fragile. If a route shifted or an empire collapsed, the local economy could decline sharply. A place built to serve exchange may have little reason to endure once exchange fades. Warehouses become ruins, quays crumble, and markets turn into quiet open spaces. A city that once lived by movement can be left still, as if all the roads around it had quietly chosen different destinations. In archaeological terms, trade networks are often visible in the objects found at a site. Foreign ceramics, seals, metalwork, and food remains can show what passed through a city and what locals valued. Such evidence turns the city into a map of movement. It tells of merchants, envoys, sailors, porters, and craftsmen whose names may not survive, but whose roots can sometimes be traced through the things they left behind. There is something deeply human about these stories. People have always followed opportunity, safety, and connection. Cities exist because movement concentrates. Lost cities remind us that movement can also disperse. When people go elsewhere, a bustling center can become a shell. Even so, that shell still preserves the shape of former energy, like the outline of a tide after the water has withdrawn, and yet shells can still be eloquent. A broken harbour wall may tell of ships that came and went. A scattered granary may suggest abundance that was once taken for granted. A faded inscription may preserve the name of a ruler who wanted the city to seem permanent. Permanence in the ancient world was always negotiated with time. Builders hoped for endurance, but whether politics and human choice always had a say. That tension between ambition and fragility gives lost cities their enduring atmosphere. They are monuments to human effort and to the changing world that effort could never fully control. They stand, or once stood, at the meeting point of intention and uncertainty. In that quiet space, the past becomes less like a fixed story and more like a landscape slowly emerging through mist. Some lost cities are preserved because disaster arrived suddenly, freezing life in place. Volcanic ash, for example, can cover entire communities with remarkable speed. In the space of a day, or even a few hours, streets that once carried footsteps, carts, and voices can become sealed beneath a grey blanket. Objects are not merely broken in such moments, they are enclosed. Food remains, wall paintings, tools, and even the arrangement of a room can survive in extraordinary condition, as if the final gestures of daily life were quietly held in suspension. The most famous example is often associated with Pompeii and Herculaneum, though those sites are more accurately described as buried than forgotten. They remained present in local memory and in the earth itself, even as their original urban life disappeared. What makes them so compelling is not only their destruction, but the way the catastrophe preserved so much of the ordinary world around it. Such preservation can feel paradoxical. A terrible event becomes, centuries later, a gift to history. Yet the gift is incomplete. It preserves a moment and takes away the living city. The streets are frozen, but the people are gone. A doorway may still stand open, a loaf of bread may still be recognized by its shape, but the hands that used these things are absent. Archaeologists must always hold both truths together, the extraordinary value of the record and the human cost that created it. In this sense, volcanic destruction does not simply erase a city. It creates a sealed memory, one that can be studied in detail, but never fully restored. Burial by ash is especially informative because it can preserve fragile materials that would normally decay. Wooden doors, food containers, painted walls, domestic fixtures, and even loose items on shelves can survive long enough to be examined. In warm or damp climates, this is unusual and deeply valuable because everyday materials tend to vanish quickly once a city is abandoned. The resulting picture is intimate. We can see kitchens, dining rooms, shops, and streets with unusual clarity. A basin may still sit near a wall. A set of scales may remain on a merchant's counter. A painted scene may still color a room with faded reds and ochres. This makes volcanic sites emotionally powerful because they capture not only monumental architecture but ordinary interruption. The silence inside such rooms can feel almost audible. At the same time, such sites remind us that urban life was often densely packed. Homes stood close together, trade happened in narrow lanes, and daily routines unfolded under the pressure of limited space. A city is not just a set of buildings. It is a choreography of proximity. People shared walls, shared wells, shared smells, and often shared the sounds of each other's work. In a dense settlement, the boundary between private and public life was thin. The ash preservation of a city can make this closeness visible, showing how much activity was compressed into a small footprint. In that sense, the ruins do not only tell us about disaster, they tell us what everyday urban life felt like before the disaster came. Even where a site was not destroyed by a volcano, ash layers from distant eruptions can alter agriculture, climate, and water systems. A city may survive the first event but struggle afterward. Fields can become less productive, seasonal rhythms can shift, and rivers may carry changed sediments. Smoke and dust can darken the sky far from the eruption itself, and the effects may be recorded in tree rings, lake beds, or written chronicles. The broader environment can carry the disaster farther than expected. This is one reason lost cities are never only local stories. They belong to larger ecological networks, where weather, soil, and water shape the fate of settlements as much as walls or rulers do. There are also ruins that appear to have been abandoned in haste. Storage jars may still sit in place, valuables may be left behind, and work areas may remain unfinished. Yet haste does not always mean panic. Sometimes people expected to return. Sometimes they left with intention, assuming the city would be occupied again, repaired, or reclaimed after a crisis had passed. In other cases, departure may have happened gradually, with families leaving one by one as conditions worsened. Loss can be ambiguous, and archaeology often uncovers that ambiguity rather than resolving it. The evidence may suggest urgency, but it may also suggest patience, uncertainty, or hope. This is true of many ancient sites. The evidence may show a sequence of occupation, repair, decline, and partial reuse. A city can be half lost while still inhabited in smaller form. Later generations may live among old ruins, using the stones for new walls or the old streets as convenient pathways. What appears to us as abandonment may, to the people living there, have been a shift in scale. The grand public spaces of an earlier age might have narrowed into neighborhoods, workshops, or temporary shelters. The city's shape changes, but life continues in altered form. That continuity matters because it reminds us that urban loss is often slow rather than sudden. In that sense, a lost city can have many afterlives. It may become a quarry, a field, a sacred remnant, or a source of building material. Its first life ends, but it continues in altered forms. Stone blocks are taken for new temples. Bricks are reused in later homes. Old foundations guide new roads. In some places, people come to regard ruins with reverence, treating them as the remnants of an ancestral age. In others, the ruin is simply practical, a reservoir of materials waiting to be carried away. These afterlives are part of the city's story too. They show that disappearance is rarely complete. What ends in one register may persist in another. Some ruins are so extensive that modern people once mistook them for natural hills or rocky outcrops. Over centuries, wind and vegetation can soften angular masonry into shapes that seem geological. Mounds grow over collapsed structures. Trees settle into old courtyards. Soil collects in stairwells and fills chambers. Only careful survey reveals that the landform is also an artifact, the residue of a city. This is one of the quiet surprises of archaeology. The border between nature and settlement is often less visible than we assume. Human-made places can become so overgrown and weathered that they begin to resemble the landscape around them. That transformation from city to landscape is one of the most poetic aspects of archaeology. Human effort becomes terrain, walls become ridges, streets become depressions, doors vanish, but the outline remains in the ground. The city does not disappear so much as it changes scale. What once held civic processions, market stalls, or family gatherings may now appear as a subtle rise or hollow in the earth. The change is not always dramatic. Sometimes the signs are faint enough to be noticed only at certain angles, in certain light, or through careful mapping. Yet even these quiet traces are enough to remind us that the land remembers. The ancient city of Angkor offers a particularly striking example of this kind of transformation. Though the ruins are widely known today, the broader urban complex was long obscured by forest and shifting settlement patterns. Angkor was not a single temple alone, but a sprawling urban environment with reservoirs, roads, embankments, and hydraulic systems supporting a large population. Its scale was immense, and its organization depended on a careful interplay between sacred centers and practical infrastructure. Travelers and later observers often saw only the most dramatic stone monuments, but beneath that visible grandeur lay a city of movement, water control, cultivation, and administration. Water management was central there as well. Reservoirs and canals helped regulate a landscape of seasonal change. In tropical environments, controlling water is as important as in deserts, though the challenge is opposite. Too much water can erode, flood, and saturate the ground. Too little can strain agriculture and reduce the reliability of harvests. The city had to balance abundance and control. This balance required maintenance, labor, and a long-term political system capable of directing resources. When the system functioned well, it could support great density and complexity. When it faltered, the effects would spread across neighborhoods, fields, and institutions. This makes Angkor valuable as a study in urban ecology. A great city is always a negotiation with its environment. It is built from local materials, but also from local patience. Canals must be cleared, reservoirs must be managed, roads must be kept open. Rice fields, forests, and inhabited zones all influence one another. When that balance shifts through drought, political pressure, or changing administrative priorities, the urban system can weaken. The city may not collapse at once. Instead, it can become harder to sustain, more fragmented, less able to command the same labor and attention. In this way, loss is often distributed across many small failures rather than one clear ending. The forest that enveloped parts of Angkor later became part of its mystery, but it also protected and softened the ruins. Roots, shade, and humidity create a complex preservation environment. Some structures decay quickly, while stone towers endure. Some walls are peeled open by vegetation, while others remain remarkably legible. The result is a landscape of layered time. A visitor may see a restored temple, a half-buried avenue, a distant pond, and a dense wall of trees all in one view. It is a reminder that ruins are not static. They change with weather, with plants, with human attention, and with the slow pressure of years. Lost cities like Angkor teach that urban greatness does not guarantee permanence. Scale can be impressive, but maintenance is constant. Reservoirs silt up, roads need clearing, and stone needs repair. A city is only as stable as the labor that sustains it. This is true of small settlements as well as vast capitals. The visible splendor of a city often rests on invisible routines: hauling, cleaning, mending, reorganizing. When those routines slow or stop, the urban order becomes fragile. And once again, what feels lost may simply be out of the line of easy use. The city lingers until the world changes around it enough that no one returns in the same way. There is a quieter class of lost cities found in river valleys where fertile soil supported long settlement, yet political change or climate stress slowly altered the pattern of life. These sites often do not look dramatic at first. They may appear as earthworks, mounds, or low stone outlines rather than towering walls, but they can contain a long sequence of occupation under the surface. Layer by layer, they record how people adapted to a reliable river, then responded to flood, drought, migration, or changing authority. In some cases, the settlement persists for centuries in a modest form, long after its most visible phase has faded. In such places, pottery is often one of the best guides. Sherds are durable, abundant, and culturally informative. Different styles can help date layers, trace trade, and identify changing habits. A broken pot may not seem grand, but across a whole site it can reveal the rhythm of centuries. The thickness of a rim, the color of a glaze, the shape of a handle, or the source of a clay mixture can all hint at broader patterns of exchange and daily life. Pottery is ordinary in the best archaeological sense. It was handled by everyone, used constantly, and left behind in fragments that survive long after the people are gone. River cities are also shaped by floods, which can be both life-giving and destructive. A flood replenishes soil and supports agriculture, but repeated flooding can damage buildings and force relocation. In some cases, a city survives by raising its ground level again and again. Streets are paved higher, floors are rebuilt, and platforms are added as the land below becomes unstable. In others, eventually the cost becomes too great. The river remains, but the relationship changes. A settlement that once depended on floodplain fertility may turn outward, shrink, or move to safer terrain. The river does not vanish. The city's negotiation with it simply ends. The people who left these places did not necessarily feel they were abandoning history. They were making practical decisions under changing conditions. Their descendants may have carried the memory of the city elsewhere, turning it into a place of origin in oral tradition. A lost city can survive in stories long after it disappears from daily use. Names may persist even when walls do not. A hill may be remembered as the site of an old palace, a temple, or a market, even if little remains above ground. These stories are not always precise in a modern documentary sense, but they preserve emotional geography. They keep a place meaningful across generations. This is one of the most important reasons lost cities matter. They are not only archaeological puzzles, they are witnesses to migration, resilience, and the human habit of adapting when the landscape changes its terms. Their remains show how communities respond to uncertainty, by rebuilding, by shifting trade, by narrowing their footprint, by moving on, or by carrying memory with them. In that way, a ruin is not simply evidence of failure, it is evidence of response. And because many such cities are found in fertile regions now used for agriculture or modern settlement, excavation is often careful and selective. Archaeologists must balance research with preservation and local life. The study of a lost city is also a conversation with the present. Fields cannot be disrupted forever. Communities live around and sometimes within the same landscapes that hold ancient remains. The work requires patience, negotiation, and restraint. In this sense, archaeology is not only about uncovering what was buried, it is about deciding what should remain undisturbed. That present-day conversation matters. A site may be threatened by erosion, development, tourism, or conflict. In that way, some cities are becoming lost again, not through ancient abandonment but through modern pressures. Preservation is never finished. It is a form of ongoing attention. Walls must be monitored, sites documented, and local knowledge respected. Even when a place is protected, the protection is active rather than absolute. Time continues to work on everything. There is something deeply calming in that idea too. To care for the past is to acknowledge that memory is fragile and worthy of steadiness. The city rests, but people continue to listen. Many lost cities are first imagined through literature or legend long before they are confirmed by evidence. Ancient texts may describe magnificent capitals, sacred centers, or drowned realms, and later generations search for traces that match the description. Sometimes the result is a genuine identification. Sometimes the literary city remains partly symbolic. Either way, the story itself can preserve a cultural memory of grandeur, disaster, or moral lesson. Legends often make lost cities seem more remote than they are. A place described as hidden in a forest, buried beneath sands, or guarded by spirits may, in reality, have been a real settlement whose exact location was simply forgotten by distant observers. The language of mystery can grow around a site when its practical history is no longer understood. There is also a pattern in which explorers announce a city as lost when local communities have known it all along. This reminds us to be careful with the word rediscovered. Archaeology is most responsible when it recognizes that knowledge is shared unevenly and that some people never lost the place at all. Texts can still be enormously helpful. Old travel accounts, inscriptions, administrative records, and maps can preserve clues that guide modern work. A line about a river bend, a temple name, or a ruined gate may seem small, but it can anchor a wider search. History often moves forward on details that once looked ordinary. Some lost cities survive in the form of foundations under later buildings. A modern street may follow an ancient route. A church, mosque, or home may stand above older layers. Urban life is cumulative. New cities are often built on top of old ones because the most practical places to live remain attractive for millennia. This means that loss can be partial. A city may not be abandoned entirely, it may become embedded in a later one. Excavation then becomes a careful descent through time, layer by layer, without assuming that one era ends cleanly before another begins. The ancient Near East offers many examples of such layered urbanism. In long-inhabited regions, mounds and tells can preserve settlement sequences stretching across enormous spans of time. A mound is not a hill in the ordinary sense. It is an accumulation of human life, houses rebuilt on house remains, roads laid over old roads, and debris compacted by centuries. These tells are especially valuable because they demonstrate continuity and change in one place. A city may shift in name, language, and ruling power, but the location itself keeps attracting settlement. Geography exerts a strong pull. Water, soil, and root still matter. There is a quiet dignity in these layered places. They remind us that cities are not single objects but long conversations between generations. The people who lived there rarely saw the full sweep of history, yet they still contributed to it. In some cases, lost cities are identified by their fortifications. Walls, towers, and gateways are easier to notice than domestic interiors, and they often survive as symbolic remnants of urban power. A wall suggests both defense and boundary. It says where the city believed itself to begin and end, but fortifications can also be misleading. A wall may have stood only briefly, or may have been symbolic rather than strictly military. Not every barrier was built for war. Some were markers of status, control, or ritual separation. The meaning of a ruin is not always obvious from its shape alone. This is why archaeological interpretation is so careful. A single feature can have many possible explanations. Researchers compare materials, context, and chronology before drawing conclusions. The result may feel less dramatic than a legend, but it is more solid. It is worth remembering that lost cities often emerged from ordinary planning. Streets had to be leveled, drainage arranged, food stored, and labor organized. Even the grandest capitals depended on mundane tasks. The romance of a ruin can hide the practical mind that built it. A city's disappearance, then, is also a story about maintenance. Roofs need repair. Canals require clearing. Paved surfaces crack. Once upkeep ends, decay begins slowly and unavoidably. The city does not collapse into nothing. It begins to be edited by weather. That slow editing gives ruins their softness. Edges round off. Mortar falls away. Plants settle into cracks. The city returns to the larger landscape from which it was briefly separated. One of the most compelling things about lost cities is their ability to compress multiple forms of knowledge into one place. From a single site, scholars may learn about politics, religion, trade, diet, engineering, climate, language, and art. Urban remains are dense archives. The city is not only where history happened, it is one of the ways history survives. At the same time, some cities disappear because their people deliberately left little behind. Rebuilding elsewhere, dismantling structures, or reusing materials can erase much of the visible footprint. In such cases, the city leaves a thinner archaeological signature, and the challenge becomes harder. Even then, traces remain. Post holes, foundation trenches, and soil chemistry can reveal occupation. The absence of monumental remains does not mean absence of life. Human settlements always alter their surroundings, even when their walls are gone. That quiet resilience of evidence is one of the reasons archaeologists can still recover so much. The land remembers more than it seems to. Dust, sediment, and buried disturbance all preserve a history written in the ground. As we move through these stories tonight, we are listening for that ground-level memory, the one that speaks softly but clearly to those willing to slow down. The city of Carroll in coastal Peru is one of the oldest known urban centers in the Americas and offers a useful reminder that lost cities are not only dramatic ruins from a single region. Human beings built cities in many different landscapes, and some of the earliest large settlements were remarkably sophisticated in planning and social organization. Carroll's setting in a dry valley helped preserve it, and its architecture shows plazas, platforms, and organized construction on a scale that implies coordinated labor. What is striking is not only its age, but the fact that it developed without some of the features later people often expect of cities, such as extensive fortification or abundant pottery in the earliest phases. Urbanism takes many forms. This is one of archaeology's quiet corrections to modern assumptions. A city does not have to look like a later European capital or a familiar imperial center in order to be urban. It may be defined by gathering, administration, ceremony, and shared infrastructure rather than by one style of monument. Carroll also helps show that absence can be informative. If a site lacks certain materials, that absence can tell us about technology, trade, or cultural practice. Archaeology is often as much about pattern recognition as it is about objects. Because the site is so old, every finding there stretches our sense of how early complex societies emerged. That is part of the charm of lost cities. They can widen the timeline in a single step. Suddenly, civilization is older, broader, and more varied than expected. People often imagine the ancient world as concentrated around a few famous regions, but cities arose independently across continents. Each one solved the problem of gathering people in a place where resources, leadership, and movement could support one another. The solutions were local, yet the challenge was universal. And in all those places, the same human pattern appears. People build, maintain, adapt, and eventually leave. Later, others arrive, and the remains become a field of questions. That field of questions is not cold or remote. It is intimate. It asks how people lived, what they feared, what they valued, and what they could not control. Lost cities ask us to imagine continuity under change, and that is a very gentle kind of historical thought. Some cities are lost because they were never intended to be permanent in the first place. Seasonal settlements, ceremonial gathering places, and temporary administrative centers can become archaeological sites after only a limited period of use. Not every ancient urban location was a fixed capital with centuries of occupation. This matters because permanence is often assumed when people hear the word city, yet mobility has always been part of human settlement. Traders, pastoral groups, rulers, and pilgrims all moved across landscapes in patterned ways, and some built places to support that movement rather than to replace it. Temporary does not mean insignificant. A site used only for part of the year might still host festivals, governance, or exchange. It may have walls, roads, storage, and symbolic architecture, even without full-time habitation. Its importance lies in timing as much as duration. In some cases, the temporary city becomes permanent in memory, while the permanent settlement changes location. A seasonal ritual center can leave a very long shadow in culture because it gathered people at key moments of the year. Its meaning survives even after its practical role fades. Archaeologists must therefore be careful not to overstate urban continuity. A site may have several lifespans, as a meeting place, a settlement, a ceremonial center, a ruin, and finally a research site. The same stones can belong to different chapters. This layered temporality is one reason lost cities are so captivating. They are not merely about endings. They are about the many ways a place can matter across time. And in the quiet of an evening like this, it is enough to let them be what they are. Places once filled with life, now speaking through their remains. A number of lost cities are connected to riverine empires that depended on irrigation and centralized administration. In such systems, city life was closely tied to the management of water, labor, and grain. Officials kept records, measured land, and coordinated production. When that administration weakened, the urban system could falter. These cities often leave written traces, which can be as important as architecture. Tablets, papyri, inscriptions, and seals preserve names, rations, taxes, and requests. Through these documents, the city becomes audible. We hear the voice of a clerk assigning grain, a worker petitioning for supplies, or a ruler recording boundaries. Written evidence can also reveal decline. Gaps in records, changes in language, and shorter administrative sequences may suggest political stress. Sometimes a city's story can be tracked through bureaucratic habits long before it is abandoned physically. The paperwork changes before the walls do. That idea may sound strangely modern, but it is ancient. Institutions are often the first to show strain. If officials relocate, if archives stop being maintained, or if supply chains fail, the city begins to weaken from within. Its loss is already underway. In these settings, the archaeological remains of storage and accounting can be especially telling. Seal impressions, ration lists, and storage jars show that cities were managed systems, not simply clusters of buildings. Urban life required trust, record keeping, and distribution. When those systems collapse, a city can empty surprisingly fast. A population dependent on one network may not survive a prolonged interruption, so the loss of a city is sometimes the visible endpoint of administrative failure. Still, even in collapse, people carry knowledge with them. Farming methods, building practices, and ritual habits travel to new sites. The city may disappear, but its ways continue elsewhere. That continuity is comforting in a quiet way. Human settlement is fragile, but human memory is mobile. The city walks on in what people remember and rebuild. Some lost cities are known mainly through archaeology because written evidence is sparse, fragmentary, or absent altogether. In those cases, scholars learn to read a different kind of language, the language of walls, pottery, bones, soil stains, and broken streets. Architecture can suggest how people moved through space. Tools can hint at daily labor. Burials can reveal belief, status, and family ties. Even the faint arrangement of refused pits or post holes can speak softly about how a community lived. The absence of writing does not mean the absence of history. It simply means the history must be reconstructed from quieter traces. This is especially important when modern audiences equate literacy with civilization. In reality, many societies organized complex urban life without leaving abundant text. A city could have roads, storage systems, public spaces, specialized craft zones, and highly regulated building practices without producing the kinds of records that survive for us today. Documents may have been written on perishable material, or they may have been lost in fire, flood, humidity, or later reuse. The city is still legible, but it is legible through its physical habits rather than through pages. One of the key clues in such places is standardization. Repeated brick sizes, consistent house layouts, regular street widths, or uniform vessel forms can suggest organized production and shared norms. These are not trivial details. They indicate that people were building with an expectation of scale, maintenance, and coordination. Urban life depends on such regularity. It allows for repairs, taxation, storage, and predictable exchange. Even when no official decree survives, the city's repeated forms can imply a civic order that once felt ordinary to its inhabitants. Another clue is specialization. A city may contain areas where metalworking, weaving, food preparation, administration, or religious ritual occurred more intensely than elsewhere. These distinctions show that the settlement was more than a village grown large by accident. It was a coordinated space with differentiated labor. Some people shaped tools, some processed grain, some managed offerings, and some maintained sacred precincts or public gathering places. The city becomes easier to understand when seen as a woven system of tasks rather than a single mass of houses. Lost cities often preserve those distinctions because abandonment can freeze a pattern that would otherwise continue to evolve. Streets stop being widened. Workshops stop being reused. Houses remain as they were when people last occupied them, at least in outline, even if roofs collapse and walls erode. That makes the archaeological record unusually useful. A site that was once full of movement can become, over time, a quiet map of prior activity. In that silence, the old organization lingers, but even where a city appears frozen, it can be deceptive. Later erosion, reuse, looting, and rebuilding can all distort the picture. Wind may strip away light walls, rain may wash material downhill. Treasure hunters may leave pits that confuse later interpretation. A site is layered, altered, and reinterpreted over centuries. Archaeologists therefore have to distinguish original arrangement from later disturbance. A ruin is not a single moment preserved in amber. It is a conversation across time, with interruptions, revisions, and missing lines. The world's vanished capitals also teach us about political symbolism. Many were built to display legitimacy. A ruler may found a new city to mark a dynasty, a conquest, or a religious reform. The placement of palaces, temples, gates, and processional routes can all communicate power. Such cities can be abandoned once the political purpose changes. Their prestige was tied to one regime, and with that regime's decline, the city's central role can fade quickly. What was once a seat of authority may become, in later centuries, a field of stones and remembered names. This makes dynastic capitals especially vulnerable. They are created with strong intent, but sometimes without broad economic roots. A court can draw labor, food, and artisans inward for a time, yet if the court leaves, the city may lose the reason for its growth. Stone built for ceremony is still stone, but the governing meaning may disappear. A throne room without a throne can become only a shell. The grandeur remains visible, though the social force that supported it has gone elsewhere. There are also cities lost because of resource depletion. Timber can be overused, soils can be exhausted by continuous farming, nearby wildlife can decline, grazing can alter the landscape in ways that reduce long-term resilience. Urban survival depends on the surrounding ecological system as much as on internal planning. A city is not sealed off from its environment. It breathes with the seasons, depends on nearby fields and forests, and suffers when those systems thin out. In that sense, the landscape is part of the city's body. In some cases, a city's decline is visible in the architecture itself. Later buildings may be smaller, more hastily built, or made of reused materials. This can signal reduced prosperity, shrinking populations, or changing priorities. Streets may narrow. Public spaces may become more private. Ornament may give way to practical repairs. Even so, decline is not always collapse. Sometimes it is adaptation to a different scale of life, with people continuing in a reduced but still meaningful urban rhythm. The ancient city of Teotihuacan in central Mexico is not lost in the sense of being undiscovered, but it remains one of the great vanished urban worlds of the ancient Americas. Its enormous scale, planned avenues, and monumental complexes still prompt questions about political organization and social life. The city's origins, internal structure, and eventual decline continue to be studied carefully. It stands as a reminder that even famous places can remain partly unreadable, and that prominence does not necessarily bring complete clarity. Teotihuacan shows that a city can be immense and yet still partially mysterious. Monumental architecture can outlast the records that explain it. When that happens, scholars read urban form as evidence. The city's layout, orientation, construction phases, and spatial hierarchy become part of the narrative. A broad avenue can suggest processional movement. A repeated compound pattern can suggest social organization. Large monuments can imply central authority, but the precise form of that authority may remain uncertain. Urban planning on this scale suggests a high degree of coordination. A broad avenue, standardized compounds, and major ceremonial centers all imply deliberate design. Yet even there, the full political story remains elusive. Mystery is not limited to small, obscure sites. It can also surround the largest ones, especially when the inscriptions are scarce or the later history of the site was turbulent. The silence around Teotihuacan is not emptiness. It is an invitation to careful thinking. That is a comforting thought for a sleep documentary. Not everything must be solved in order to be appreciated. Some places are valuable precisely because they remain partially open to interpretation. The mind can rest beside a question when the question is held gently. In that way, the mystery itself becomes part of the experience rather than an obstacle to it. And that openness allows the imagination to slow down without needing to race ahead. The city stands in the mind as a broad, quiet shape, lit by scholarship and softened by time. One can picture long avenues under calm sky, stone platforms warm in the afternoon light, and the gradual settling of centuries over a place whose builders never imagined our questions. In the forests of Central America, lost cities often survive as mounds, terraces, and partially standing pyramids rather than as cleanly exposed streets. Thick vegetation can hide architecture for centuries, and yet that same vegetation may also protect it from some forms of erosion. Roots, leaf litter, and dense canopy create a damp, shaded world in which stone disappears and reappears with patience. The forest is both cloak and caretaker, concealing the old city while also sheltering it from harsh weather and careless attention. This has made LiDAR and other remote sensing methods especially important in the region. By reading through vegetation cover, researchers can reveal networks of roads, reservoirs, settlement patterns, and terraces that were invisible from the ground. The discovery of urban density in forested landscapes has transformed our understanding of ancient population size and organization. Places once imagined as thinly occupied now appear to have been heavily shaped by human hands, with pathways and water systems extending far beyond the obvious monumental core. These findings have also challenged the old image of isolated jungle cities. Instead of scattered monuments alone, we now see connected urban landscapes with agriculture, transport, and planning. The city was embedded in a working environment. Fields, canals, causeways, and smaller residential groups may have surrounded ceremonial centers in an integrated pattern. The grandeur of a temple cannot be separated from the daily labor that fed, moved, and supported the people around it. That broader view matters. Lost cities are sometimes imagined as isolated wonders, but most were part of regional systems. They relied on fields, villages, water sources, and roads. A city is never just a city. It is an expression of a much larger inhabited territory, a place where exchange, labor, belief, and administration meet. Even a splendid capital depends on the smaller settlements around it, much as a bright star depends on the wider sky to be seen at all. The silence of a forested ruin can be especially complete. Birds, insects, and moisture create a different atmosphere than the dry hush of desert sites. Stone emerges from green shadow, and the ruins feel less like a vacancy than a conversation between past and present life. Ferns may grow in stairways. Vines may drape over platforms. Rainwater gathers in depressions that once held offerings, steps, or storage. The site becomes gentle in appearance, though its history may have been intense. Because so much of the structure may remain hidden below the canopy, interpretation can be tentative. A mound might be a platform, a palace base, a burial zone, or an altered natural feature. A straight line in the undergrowth might be a road, a wall, or simply a trick of terrain. The excitement of discovery must be balanced by caution. Archaeology advances through restraint as much as revelation. It is often the patient refusal to overstate a finding that allows the truth to emerge with greater confidence. This balance between wonder and discipline is part of what gives the field its quiet dignity. It does not rush to declare a mystery solved. It listens until the evidence is clear enough to speak. In that listening, there is something almost meditative. The site yields its meaning slowly in layers, and the researcher learns to wait with the same steadiness that the earth itself displays. Some lost cities are linked to famous trails, roads, or pilgrimage routes. Their importance came from movement rather than from isolation. A city that served travelers, officials, merchants, or pilgrims could flourish at the meeting point of paths. It might provide water, shelter, food, markets, ritual services, or political supervision. When those paths changed, the city might lose its centrality. A crossroads can be powerful, but it is also dependent on the direction of traffic. Road cities are especially revealing because transport infrastructure leaves a strong physical trace. Paved surfaces, roadside stations, milestones, bridges, and rest stops show how people moved. The city's position in relation to these routes helps explain its rise and decline. A settlement near a pass, river crossing, or coastal lane could prosper for generations. Then a new bridge, a safer road, or a shift in trade can alter the pattern, leaving the old center quietly behind. A road can be a lifeline, but it is also a vulnerability. If a new route offers less resistance, better security, or quicker access to trade, the old city can be bypassed. What was once a necessary stop becomes an inconvenience. Merchants adjust. Pilgrims choose another path. Administrators relocate. The city remains on the map, but the flow of life has moved elsewhere, and the buildings begin to feel the long patience of disuse. This is why urban geography matters so much in the study of lost cities. A site's location is never accidental. It reflects choices about water, defense, visibility, and access. When those conditions change, the city's logic changes with them. A hilltop that once offered security may become hard to reach. A river that once nourished trade may shift course. A valley once favored for travel may become marginal. The city is always in dialogue with the land. Yet even as routes shift, the remains endure in place. A traveler's path may vanish from use, but the stones remain to tell of movement long after the wagons and caravans are gone. Broken paving, worn thresholds, and abandoned way stations preserve an echo of passing feet. The journey has ended, but its trace stays quietly visible. And in that lingering afterimage of roads and thresholds, there is a deep and restful reminder. Civilization is built on motion, but memory can stay still. Another important pattern in lost city research is reuse. When a city declines, nearby communities may strip usable stone, brick, or timber for new construction. This is not vandalism in the modern sense. It is often practical survival. Building materials are valuable, and old walls are convenient quarries. In climates where resources are scarce or transport is difficult, it makes sense to take what is already available. The ruin becomes part of the next settlement's foundation. Reuse can obscure the original layout of a site, but it also tells a human story. People were not treating ruins as sacred museum objects. They were living in changing circumstances and making use of what remained. The boundary between ancient and later life is often very porous. A fallen column might become a doorstep. A decorated block might be turned into a field marker. A foundation might support a different generation's home. The past does not always sit apart from the present, it is sometimes incorporated into it. In some cases, later buildings stand directly atop older foundations. A medieval house may rest on Roman stone, or a new temple may be built from the blocks of an earlier sanctuary. The city becomes a palimpsest, one generation written over another. This layered quality is especially striking in long-occupied places, where the ground itself seems to remember repeated acts of building, removal, and renewal. The old city survives not as a single intact form, but as a presence folded into later use. For archaeologists, reuse is both a challenge and a clue. It can blur chronology, but it also shows continuity of place. The site never truly stopped mattering. Even when people did not know the original story of a wall or block, they still found value in its material. That practical respect, however ordinary, is one of the ways the past remains alive. And there is something calm in that persistence. A city may lose its original form and still remain part of a living landscape. Not every lost city is a total absence. Some are only partially visible, their older identities folded into later lives. They continue quietly, layer beneath layer, memory beneath memory. That folded history is one of the richest aspects of the subject. It invites us to think in layers, not endings. Some lost cities owe their modern fame to explorers. but the first visitor narratives were often shaped by colonial assumptions. Early accounts might frame a site as discovered, civilized, or mysterious in ways that reveal more about the writer than the place. Modern scholarship tries to correct this by emphasizing local knowledge, indigenous histories, and the continuity of occupation around the ruins. That corrective is important because the story of a lost city is never just about the stones. It is also about who gets to tell the story. A site may be meaningful in oral tradition long before it is mapped by outsiders. It may be known by several names, each belonging to a different language or time period. In responsible archaeology, rediscovery is therefore a shared and often contested process. Guides, farmers, elders, labourers, and local residents have often played crucial roles in identifying sites. Their knowledge is not supplementary, it is central. This broader perspective also changes how we understand abandonment. A city that appears empty to one historian may still be part of a ceremonial landscape, a grazing area, or a remembered homeland. Loss is never complete if people continue to live near the ruins, tell stories about them, or use them in ritual life. There are also examples of cities that were deliberately hidden. In times of danger, communities may remove portable objects, cover sacred items, or abandon a place with the hope of return. Such hiding is not the same as forgetting. It can be a strategy of survival. This means some ruins preserve moments of decision. Doorways blocked from the inside, goods cached in corners, or valuables buried beneath floors can all indicate an intention to preserve or reclaim. A city is not always left in defeat. Sometimes it is tucked away. Archaeologists pay close attention to these signs because they reveal the emotional side of abandonment. People do not leave cities as if turning off a lamp. They negotiate delay and hope. In the ancient Aegean, several settlements vanished after earthquakes, volcanic activity, or shifting political fortunes. The region's long urban history means that layers of different eras often sit close together. A city may be preserved beneath later habitation or under debris from natural events. The Aegean world is especially rich in maritime connectivity. Ports and island settlements depended on sea routes that linked many communities. As with other trade regions, shifts in power or shipping patterns could have large consequences. A harbour once busy with oars and sails could become quiet in a generation or two. Seismic activity is another reminder that the ground itself is not fixed. Earthquakes can topple walls, redirect water, and destabilize storage systems. Even when a city is not completely destroyed, repeated shocks can make life difficult enough to encourage departure. Yet the ruins left behind by such events can be unusually informative. Fallen walls, collapsed floors, and mixed layers help reconstruct the sequence of damage. Disaster archaeology reads catastrophe carefully without reducing it to spectacle. That care matters because it preserves the dignity of the people who lived through it. Their lives were not merely dramatic endings. They were full of maintenance, labor, family, and adaptation. And in that quiet recognition, the lost city becomes less like a puzzle from afar and more like a human neighborhood from which time has gently stepped back. In the ancient Mediterranean, some cities rose because they controlled strategic passes, fertile plains, or access to metals. Their wealth depended on geography, and so did their vulnerability. A city placed for advantage could also become a target. Military destruction leaves traces such as burned layers, arrowheads, collapsed defenses, and interrupted occupation. But even in war, the archaeological picture is usually complex. A city may be attacked, rebuilt, reoccupied, and then finally abandoned much later. The memory of conflict outlasts the conflict itself. This complexity is easy to miss if one imagines ruins as frozen battlefields. In reality, many sites show long sequences of recovery. Residents repair walls, resume trade, and continue life under changed conditions. The final loss may occur only after repeated strain has exhausted the community. Fortified cities are especially vivid because their walls suggest both fear and confidence. A defense line implies that the city believed itself worth protecting. Towers and gates were practical, but they were also statements of identity. A fortified city announces itself as a place that expects to endure. That expectation can be poignant when the walls still stand, but the people are gone. The stone remains loyal to a purpose that history no longer needs. There are also lost cities whose location is disputed even after excavation. Scholars may debate which ancient name belongs to which ruin, or whether a site mentioned in texts should be identified with one mound rather than another. Such debates are not failures. They are part of the discipline's honesty. A city's identity is sometimes assembled from converging clues rather than proven by a single inscription. That cautious process may seem slow, but it protects against overstatement, and slower is often better for understanding. In the stillness of a bedtime documentary, uncertainty can feel less like confusion and more like depth. Not every old road has a sign, and not every ruin needs one to be meaningful. The famous Silk Roads were not one road but many overlapping routes, and cities along them often flourished as exchange points across enormous distances. Such places may be among the most cosmopolitan of the ancient world, containing languages, religions, and goods from several regions at once. Because their prosperity depended on movement, these cities could be vulnerable to changes in security or political structure. If trade shifted, the city's role could diminish. Caravan traffic is powerful, but it is also sensitive to taxation, warfare, and climate. These settlements often leave mixed material signatures. You may find local architecture alongside imported ceramics, foreign coins, or tools from different traditions. The city becomes evidence of contact, not isolation. Its streets once carried not only goods but ideas. That is one reason lost cities are such effective teaching tools. They let us see how interconnected the ancient world really was. Trade did not simply enrich elites. It altered food, language, fashion, and daily routines. At the same time, trade cities can be less easy to romanticize than imperial capitals. They may be messy, practical, and layered with warehouse districts, inns, stables, and working quarters. Yet this ordinariness is precisely what makes them beautiful to study. A city that served travelers had to be flexible. It needed storage, repair, accommodation, and information. When those services were no longer needed, the city's center of gravity shifted elsewhere. Even so, the remains can preserve a sense of motion. Road surfaces, loading areas, and open courtyards hint at the rhythm of arrivals and departures. One can almost imagine the quiet after a caravan left, when dust settles and the gates close. That settling dust is a fitting image for many lost cities. They were once animated by exchange, and now they invite us to slow our own pace and imagine the world they held. A number of ancient cities became lost because they were built in regions where river mouths, deltas, and marshlands changed over time. Delta environments are fertile but unstable. Silt can build up in harbors, channels can shift, and land can expand or flood unpredictably. This instability affects every part of urban life. A city that once faced open water may eventually find ships unable to reach it. A port that was vital to trade may become inland and less useful. Agricultural fields may become waterlogged or cut off from irrigation. In such settings, decline can feel like geography quietly rewriting the terms of existence. Delta cities often leave interesting mixtures of preservation and decay. Waterlogged soil can protect organic materials, but it can also make excavation difficult. Wooden structures, seeds, and reeds may survive exceptionally well if oxygen is limited. Such sites can yield intimate details of food, craft, and construction. The challenge is that deltas rarely remain still long enough to be easy. Their very fertility comes from movement of sediment and water. A city built there must continually adapt. If adaptation fails, the urban center may drift toward abandonment while a new settlement forms nearby. This pattern can be seen across many periods and regions. Population does not vanish, it relocates. The city's identity moves, sometimes keeping the old name, sometimes taking a new one. Lost cities are therefore often part of longer urban sequences rather than isolated endpoints. Modern environmental change gives these ancient processes renewed relevance. Rising sea levels, erosion, and shifting rainfall show how vulnerable low-lying settlements can be. Studying old lost cities helps us understand how communities responded in the past, though the present remains its own challenge. For the listener tonight, that may be the gentlest truth of all. Cities are temporary arrangements between people and place. They are real, durable, and meaningful, yet they depend on conditions that never stay fixed. That impermanence does not diminish them, it deepens them. One of the most beautiful aspects of lost cities is the way they preserve craftsmanship. A city may be abandoned, but its carved stone, painted plaster, woven fragments, metal fittings, or ceramic decoration can still reveal the skill of the makers. Art survives as a form of labor made visible. Craft quarters are especially important because they show how cities functioned economically. Potters, smiths, carpenters, dyers, masons, and scribes all contributed to urban life. Their workshops may be humble, but their work shaped the identity of the entire city. In many ruins, the best preserved evidence of craftsmanship is found not in grand buildings but in small fragments. A patterned tile, a chisel mark, or a painted border can reveal style and technique. These details connect a lost city to the people who touched its surfaces every day. Craft also helps identify cultural exchange. Designs move across regions, altered by local taste. A decorative motif may show influence from distant lands, but adapted in a way that belongs to the city itself. The result is a kind of quiet cosmopolitanism. There is a special tenderness in studying these objects because they are often the most human-scale remains. They were made by hand, used by hand, and discovered by hand centuries later. Through them, the city feels close. And close is a lovely word for a bedtime journey. It suggests not only nearness in space, but intimacy and understanding. Lost cities do not need to shout. Their fragments are enough. As we continue, we can let each one appear with the patience it deserves, like a candle being lit in a corridor of stone. Some lost cities are best understood through their water systems. Aqueducts, wells, channels, reservoirs, cisterns, and drainage lines are often more revealing than the largest temple or palace, because they show the daily arrangements that made the city livable. Water was not an occasional concern. It was the background condition of survival, and city builders invested heavily in controlling it, storing it, and guiding it through streets, courtyards, and fields. In dry regions, storage systems collected rainfall and runoff with great care. Roofs, courtyards, and sloped surfaces were designed to channel water into basins or underground cisterns. In wetter regions, drainage prevented flooding, soft ground, and damp damage that could weaken walls and foundations. In mountain sites, terracing managed slope and erosion, turning steep land into usable urban space. In river valleys, canals linked fields and neighborhoods, carrying both water and commerce through the same landscape. A city's water network tells us how it thought about life itself, not as a single feature, but as a sequence of careful choices repeated across seasons. Many archaeological sites preserve these systems because they were built with durable materials and maintained again and again. Stone-lined conduits, plastered channels, and cut rock passages can survive long after roofs collapse and wooden posts decay. Even when buildings crumble, water lines may remain visible like quiet signatures beneath the soil. Their roots often map the original urban plan more clearly than later ruins do, because utility tended to follow logic, and logic leaves traces. Archaeologists can sometimes trace a city's habits simply by following where water once moved. The study of ancient water management also reveals communal labor. Large systems required coordination, not just individual household effort. Someone had to dig, shape, clean, repair, and monitor them. Someone had to decide when the sluices were opened, when the reservoirs were cleared of sediment, and when the channels were lined or rebuilt. The city had to organize its resources around collective needs. That is one reason urbanism became so powerful in the ancient world. It allowed shared infrastructure, and shared infrastructure made larger communities possible. Yet water systems are fragile when maintenance ends. Sediment fills channels, walls crack, pumps, gates, or sluices fail, roots creep in. Floodwater pushes where it should not. A city may endure many years of repair before one neglected system slowly tips it toward decline. Sometimes the first sign is not dramatic at all. A garden dries out, a courtyard stays muddy, a drain backs up after a storm. The failure begins in small practical frustrations before it becomes visible as abandonment. This fragility creates a subtle link between engineering and disappearance. The same care that built the city must continue, or the city slowly unravels. Civilization is a process, not a possession. It is not something a culture simply has once and for all. It is something people renew in ordinary acts, often without ceremony, day after day, through attention to pipes, channels, and walls that most eyes would otherwise overlook. Some of the best preserved lost cities sit in places where dry air slowed decay. In these environments, wooden beams, textiles, leather, baskets, and even food can survive longer than expected. The absence of moisture changes everything. A wall painting may remain bright, a rope may keep its twist, a loaf may keep its shape, and a footprint in dust may seem almost recent. Such preservation gives researchers a rare chance to reconstruct interior life rather than only architecture. Objects found in storage rooms and domestic spaces often feel especially immediate. A basket, a spoon, a spindle, a notebook, a toy, a clay seal, or a pair of sandals can connect us directly to routines that were once ordinary and entirely unremarkable to the people who used them. The grandeur of a city is often less memorable than its habits, and the habits are what archaeology can sometimes preserve. A city's meaning may lie not only in its monuments, but in the careful folding of cloth, the mending of tools, the keeping of records, and the quiet arrangement of belongings in a corner of a room. There are also cities lost because a dominant political center was replaced by another. New capitals were founded to express new power, new gods, new dynasties, or new ways of ruling. The old city might remain occupied, but its political importance could collapse. Once administration moved away, commerce, elite residence, and ceremonial prestige often followed. Officials relocated, artisans followed patrons, trade routes adjusted to the new center of gravity. This can happen without any visible catastrophe. There may be no fire horizon, no layer of ash, no obvious mass destruction. The old city simply becomes secondary. Its buildings remain, but decisions are made elsewhere. Taxes are assessed elsewhere. Ceremonies are staged elsewhere. It is still inhabited, yet no longer central, and that quiet demotion can be as significant as sudden ruin. That distinction is important. A city can be socially alive while politically diminished. Houses may still be occupied. Markets may still function. Temples may still receive offerings. Children may still play in courtyards where ancestors once debated policy. In archaeological terms, the loss of prominence is different from total abandonment. The site may continue, but in altered form, with fewer traces of power and more traces of everyday adaptation. Some ancient capitals were so tied to royal presence that their decline was almost guaranteed when the dynasty changed. Courtiers, scribes, guards, craftsmen, and administrators had little reason to stay if the court departed. Their migration turns the city into a memory of statehood. What remains is often a shell of former ceremony, with processional spaces larger than the surviving population needed, and palatial rooms more echoing than occupied. The city becomes a place where authority once gathered, and the silence of that absence can be felt even through ruins. At times, those memories are preserved in monumental architecture that outlived the regime. Colossal walls, formal gateways, ceremonial avenues, or platform foundations may remain for centuries after the political system that created them disappeared. Visitors then encounter a city that is larger than its surviving purpose. Its scale suggests order, processions, and public life, yet the present may offer only wind, dust, and scattered fragments. That mismatch between scale and present silence creates a distinctive mood. The site feels both important and empty, as if it is waiting for an authority that will never return. Broad staircases lead nowhere. Great courts are crossed only by light and birds. The geometry of power remains, but the power itself has gone. And yet the waiting is only hours. The stones are simply continuing their long, patient existence, holding shape under sky and weather with no expectation at all. A city can also be lost through the gradual merging of urban zones. As populations grow or move, distinct settlements may expand into one another, later making it difficult to identify the original boundaries. What began as separate towns can become a continuous urban field, and the older names may fade from memory even while the built environment persists. Streets are rerouted, districts are renamed, and the old centers are absorbed into a larger whole. In such cases, the lost city is not erased, it is absorbed. Its streets may remain beneath later roads, its neighborhoods under later districts, its walls under later foundations. The layers are real, but the older identity is harder to isolate. A map may show one continuous place where long ago several distinct communities stood side by side. The past survives, but in pieces so interwoven that the original outline becomes difficult to see. This is especially common in ancient regions with long continuity of habitation. The same favorable site draws people repeatedly over centuries. Rather than seeing one city replace another, we can think of an urban sequence with changing emphasis. One era favors a palace quarter, another expands the market, another builds over the old sacred district. A later town inherits the same slope, harbor, crossing, or ridge, and simply keeps going where earlier people left off. This continuity can be beautiful in its own way. It suggests that place has a kind of gravity. Rivers, hills, passes, and harbors continue to attract human settlement even after empires fade. A city is often less an invention than a long conversation with geography. People return because the land invites return. The same bank, inlet, ford, or valley bottom remains useful across different languages and different rulers. Archaeology helps recover that conversation by separating phases of construction. Different masonry styles, road levels, and pottery layers can show how the place evolved. One wall belongs to one age, a repaired threshold to another, a fill layer to another still. The result is not a single frozen moment, but a timeline in built form. The city becomes readable as succession, with each phase resting on the remains of the one before it, and that timeline often reveals adaptation rather than collapse. Communities may keep using old sacred spaces, reoccupying old houses, or rebuilding along inherited lines. A shrine may be maintained even when the political center has shifted. A neighborhood pattern may persist after the formal street grid changes. The lost city becomes a thread woven into a later settlement, still present though less visible than it once was. There is a restful thought in that as well. History does not always end. Sometimes it continues quietly in altered shapes, like a river taking a new course but still flowing. The old channel may dry, but the water remains in motion somewhere nearby. So too with cities. Decline is not always disappearance but redirection. Some lost cities are famous because of treasure, but treasure is not what makes them historically valuable. Gold, jewelry, and precious objects can be striking, yet ordinary objects usually tell us more about the life of the whole community. A bead may be beautiful, but a broken cooking pot may say more about a household's rhythm. A royal ornament may tell us about status, while a grinding stone tells us about breakfast, labor, and time. A city's wealth was often stored in forms that were practical rather than decorative. Grain, tools, cloth, salt, fuel and livestock mattered more day to day than ceremonial riches. This is why storage facilities are so important in archaeology. Granaries, magazines, and warehouses show how cities survived seasonal uncertainty. They reveal whether food was local or imported, whether surplus was centralized, and whether authorities planned for lean periods. Storage also reveals planning. A city with effective storage was preparing for tax collection, military needs, ritual feasting, or times of shortage. The contents and layout of storage spaces help reconstruct political and social organization. Rows of jars suggest one pattern, sealed bins suggest another. Massive communal granaries suggest a different level of coordination entirely. Even empty storage rooms are informative because emptiness can indicate removal, redistribution, or crisis. Sometimes large storage areas are linked to redistribution systems where central authorities collected goods and issued them as needed. This is another sign that a city was more than a cluster of houses. It was a managed economy. Food and materials moved through structured channels, and those channels could support temples, armies, workers, and officials. The city did not merely consume, it organized consumption. When such systems failed, stored goods could be abandoned or looted. The emptying of a storehouse can mark the beginning of decline. Once reserves are gone, resilience weakens. Scarcity becomes more likely. Dependence on outside supply increases. Even so, the remains of storage are often subtle. Bins, jars, racks, platforms, and sealed rooms may be the only evidence. Their quiet utilitarianism is easy to overlook, but they are among the most important clues to urban life. Lost cities remind us that civilizations are built not only on grand ideas but on logistics. Food must arrive, water must be stored, fuel must be available, waste must be removed, paths must be kept open, roofs must be patched. These unglamorous tasks are the real scaffolding of a city. Philosophy, ritual, and power depend on them more than they admit, and because they are so fundamental, their traces are deeply informative. Through them, we learn how people made complexity sustainable. We learn how they turned a difficult landscape into a workable one. We learn how much effort went into making ordinary life feel ordinary. That sustainability is fragile, but the record of it, preserved in the earth, gives us a gentle and lasting form of understanding. There are cities that became lost because their ceremonial language changed. When a religion transforms, the old holy places may lose their relevance or be reinterpreted in new ways. A sacred precinct can become a ruin, a quarry, a memorial, or a place of pilgrimage for a different tradition. A temple court might be converted into a residence. A shrine might become a boundary marker. A once sacred stair might remain in use, though no one any longer remembers the chants that once accompanied it. This does not mean the earlier meaning disappears completely. Instead, layers of interpretation accumulate. A site might be remembered as the seat of an older god, then reused for a new cult, and later studied as an archaeological monument. Each generation sees something different there. Some see sanctity, some see utility, some see history. The stones remain, but their significance shifts like light across water. In such places, architecture is often a powerful clue. Altar orientations, processional paths, iconography, incense burners, offering pits, and spatial hierarchy reveal ritual use. Even absent texts, the body of the city can show how people moved through sacred space. A stairway may indicate ascent. A courtyard may indicate gathering. A hidden chamber may suggest exclusivity. The arrangement itself can be a kind of language. Ceremonial cities often occupy elevated or especially visible locations, which helps them stand apart from ordinary settlement. Their placement may reflect cosmological ideas, lines of sight, or symbolic relationships with mountains, rivers, or celestial events. The landscape becomes part of worship. A ridge may frame a sunrise. A river bend may echo a sacred curve. A distant peak may act as a divine presence on the horizon. When these centers lose importance, The physical structures may remain astonishingly intact because they were built with durable materials and maintained carefully. Their silence can feel profound, like a room after a ceremony has ended. The air feels held, the steps remain, the altar remains, but the voices have gone elsewhere. Scholars approach these sites with caution and respect because ritual remains are easy to overinterpret. A line of stones might be a road, a boundary, a terrace edge, or a sacred axis. A platform might be ceremonial or practical. A marked enclosure might be for offerings or for storage. Evidence must guide the imagination, especially in places where symbolism can be tempting to see everywhere. That restraint is useful even for listeners. It lets mystery remain without forcing a conclusion. A lost city can simply be a place where old meanings are still visible, though no longer spoken aloud. Its stones can keep their silence. Its pathways can keep their shape. Its chambers can rest in shadow. And in the quiet after speech, the ruins seem to breathe more slowly, which is exactly the pace we want tonight. A surprisingly large number of lost cities were once surrounded by farmland, and their urban fate was tied to the fields that fed them. Behind the walls, the temples, the market streets, and the administrative buildings, there was always a quieter world of canals, terraces, granaries, orchards, and grazing land. The city was never an isolated shape on the map. It was the visible center of a much larger agricultural pattern, and that pattern had to keep working day after day for the city to remain viable. If agriculture declined, the city could not remain strong for long. That dependence could be subtle at first. A harvest might fail in one season, then recover in the next. A canal might silt up, then be repaired. But over time, repeated strain could weaken the whole system. Soil exhaustion, drought, salinization, deforestation, and erosion all reduced the carrying capacity of the land. The field simply could not produce the same surplus forever, and without surplus, urban life became harder to sustain. This is what makes ancient urban history so deeply environmental. A city is not only architecture and administration. It is food, fuel, water, and climate, all woven together in a delicate balance. When any one of those changes, the urban rhythm changes too. Sometimes the adjustment is gradual, with people shifting crops, moving settlements, or changing irrigation methods. Sometimes the pressure is too severe, and the city begins to thin out as families leave in search of better ground. Irrigation can be both a blessing and a risk. It allows farming in dry places and turns river valleys and desert margins into productive landscapes. In many early civilizations, irrigation was a kind of quiet engineering miracle, carrying water into fields that would otherwise have remained dry and sparse. But over time, it can also cause salt buildup in soils if not managed carefully. Water evaporates, salts remain, and the earth slowly becomes less fertile. In some ancient regions, this process unfolded over generations, almost invisibly at first. By the time the decline was obvious, the fields had already changed. That is one reason some ancient regions saw long-term agricultural decline. The city's fields slowly lost productivity, and the population had to seek better ground. What looks in hindsight like a dramatic urban disappearance may have been experienced by residents as a long sequence of compromises. Shorter planting cycles, smaller harvests, changing diets, reduced trade, and eventually migration. The city did not always vanish suddenly. Sometimes it simply became less able to hold its people. In forested zones, the challenge may be different. Clearing land can improve farming for a time, but it can also lead to erosion or resource strain. When forests are cut for fields, fuel, and construction, the landscape can begin to thin in ways that are easy to underestimate. Topsoil washes away, nearby streams shift, and the materials needed to maintain the city become harder to obtain. The city becomes a pressure point in a wider ecological system, drawing from it and in time being shaped by its limits. This is why ancient collapse studies increasingly focus on landscape, not just ruins. A site may look like a political mystery, Yet the answer lies in environmental history, in patterns of rainfall, sediment, and vegetation that changed long before the last wall fell. Drought records, pollen analysis, lake sediments, and soil studies all help build the picture. They can show whether a region dried out, whether forests retreated, whether farming became less stable, and whether human populations adapted or moved away. The result is often less dramatic than a tale of sudden doom, and more realistic. Cities change because human ambition meets changing conditions. They rise on land that can support them, and they weaken when that support shifts. That is a universal story, and a quietly sobering one. It reminds us that even the strongest urban centers are part of natural systems, not separate from them. Some of the most evocative lost cities are those where urban space was planned with geometry in mind. Straight streets, measured blocks, aligned districts, and public plazas can give a city a calm visual order. Even when the original paint, rooflines, and crowds are gone, the underlying plan still speaks. It can be felt in the spacing of foundations, in the angle of roads, in the repetition of courtyards and chambers. There is a particular elegance in that kind of organization, as though the city were designed to be read from above or remembered in sections. When the people leave, that order remains visible even in ruin. A planned city can feel almost musical in its proportions. Repetition and symmetry create a rhythm that survives the loss of life. The silence then becomes part of the design, even though it was never intended. Walking through such a place, one senses not only absence but former intention. The city still knows what it wanted to be, yet planning alone never guarantees durability. A beautifully organized city can still be vulnerable if politics shift or resources fail. Order is not permanence. A grid can outlast a dynasty, but it cannot by itself secure water, safety, or trade. A ceremonial avenue can remain perfectly aligned long after the society that built it has fragmented. Geometry preserves memory, but not necessarily continuity. Many ancient cities were also multilingual. Merchants, officials, soldiers, and pilgrims may have spoken different languages within the same urban space. This is one of the reasons lost cities can feel so cosmopolitan in scholarly reconstruction, even if only fragments survive. Inscriptions, loanwords, and naming patterns reveal this diversity. A single marketplace may have carried multiple tongues at once, each used for different purposes, each linked to a different network of power, trade, or devotion. The city becomes a place of contact in both speech and trade. One person arrives with goods from inland routes, another with customs from the coast, another with ritual knowledge, another with official authority. Over time, languages mingle. Some words are borrowed into local speech, others remain confined to sacred or administrative use. Even when the city is gone, its multilingual character can survive in records long after the buildings have disappeared. A single name on a shard or seal can open a window into cultural interchange. Scholars often build large historical arguments from these small traces. A title, a personal name, a place name, a formula repeated on clay or stone can reveal migration, diplomacy, or the presence of outsiders in the urban core. These tiny pieces matter because they preserve social complexity that monumental architecture cannot fully express. There is a similar richness in burial practice. Cemeteries near lost cities can show who was buried where, with what goods, and in what orientation. The dead help map the living city. Funerary customs reveal identity, belief, and social rank. In some places, graves are placed near roads, water sources, or boundary lines, suggesting that burial was connected to both memory and geography. In others, the arrangement of tombs reflects family ties or neighborhood divisions that no longer exist above ground. Cemeteries can also preserve details of daily life with surprising intimacy. Pottery placed with the dead, bits of jewelry, food offerings, woven materials, or carved markers all hint at the habits and hopes of the community. Even the simplest burial can speak about the values of the living. The choice of where to place the body, what direction to face, what objects to include, and what rites to perform all form part of the city's wider cultural language. In some regions, cemeteries outlast the urban centre itself. People may continue visiting ancestral graves long after daily life has moved elsewhere. The city is lost as a settlement, but remains as a memory landscape. Paths continue to be walked. Offerings may still be left. A ruined gate or collapsed wall can become less important than the burial ground nearby, where family lineage and belonging are still quietly affirmed. That persistence of memory is one of the gentlest themes in archaeology. It suggests that place can continue to matter even after its busiest days are gone. The stones may break and the roofs may fall, but the emotional map can remain. Names are remembered, boundaries are honored, old routes are followed. In this way, a lost city is not always entirely lost to the people who inherit its surroundings. There is something deeply human in that. We do not only build places. We keep returning to them in memory, in ritual, and in story. Even when structures fade, attachment can remain soft and persistent, and that is perhaps why lost cities feel so calm in the mind. They are places where the human noise has softened, but the meaning has not disappeared. In several parts of the world, lost cities are being revealed by changing technology rather than dramatic excavation. LIDAR ground surveys, photogrammetry, and geophysical tools have helped researchers detect walls, roads, and buildings beneath forests, soil, or rubble. What once required years of digging can now begin with patterns seen from the air or sensed beneath the surface. The result can be astonishingly gentle in its own way, a city appearing not as a violent revelation, but as a faint outline patiently brought into view. These methods are especially powerful because they reduce unnecessary disturbance. Instead of digging widely, archaeologists can target specific areas and preserve more of the site. That carefulness matters in fragile landscapes. A ruin that has survived for centuries can still be damaged quickly by over-excavation, erosion, or exposure. The best modern work often begins with restraint, allowing the site to speak as much as possible before anything is removed. The technology also changes the emotional scale of discovery. A vast urban pattern can appear all at once as a map, showing neighborhoods and routes invisible from the surface. What seemed isolated may turn out to be part of a much larger settlement system. A hill thought to be natural may carry the trace of terraces or walls. A patch of forest may conceal streets. A plain may hold the faint geometry of a buried district. That has altered our understanding of population density in many ancient regions. Some cultures that were once imagined as sparsely urban have turned out to have supported extensive settlement networks. The city was not alone, it was one node among many. It may have linked to smaller communities, satellite farms, ritual sites, and road stations, forming a living web rather than a single point of power. Still, technology does not replace interpretation. A map reveals form, but form must be read in context. A line in the ground could be a wall, a terrace, a road, or a natural feature. Evidence and judgment move together. Archaeologists have to compare surface patterns with environmental data, artifact distribution, local history, and construction techniques before drawing conclusions. Discovery is not just seeing something new, it is learning how to understand it without rushing. This combination of precision and patience is one reason archaeology feels so compatible with sleep listening. It is a discipline of slowing down, noticing, and avoiding haste. It rewards careful observation more than dramatic certainty. A fragment can be enough. A shadow in the soil can matter. The work moves at the pace of attention. And tonight, as these city traces drift by, the mind can rest inside that measured attention. Some lost cities are now protected as World Heritage Sites, while others remain vulnerable to conflict, looting, weather, or development. Preservation is a continuing responsibility, not a final achievement. Once a site is known, it must still be cared for. Recognition can be a beginning, not an ending. A place may be famous and still fragile. This is true of even the most celebrated ruins. Tourism can help fund preservation, but it can also create pressure. Conservation must balance access with protection. The aim is not to freeze a place entirely, but to allow it to endure. That often means limiting foot traffic, managing vegetation, stabilizing walls, and planning visitor routes with great care. The most successful preservation efforts are usually the least flashy because they focus on preventing loss rather than displaying intervention. That endurance depends on more than experts. Local communities, governments, and visitors all play a role. A site survives when many people value it as more than scenery. It needs legal protection, public respect, and practical support. A city that once depended on many hands to function may, centuries later, depend on many hands again to remain legible. There is a quiet lesson here about memory and stewardship. Lost cities are powerful because they remind us that human creations are fragile, but they also show that care can extend a ruin's life for generations. The city may no longer function, yet it can still teach, inspire, and gather attention. It can still offer beauty without being whole. When we look at a ruin responsibly, we are participating in its next chapter. We are not merely seeing what is left, we are helping decide what remains legible for the future. That is a subtle form of inheritance, one that asks for patience rather than ownership. That is a solemn but comforting thought. The past is not fully gone, and the future is shaped by how gently we handle its traces. So the story of lost cities is also a story of responsibility, patience, and quiet respect. And in that respect, the ruins continue to live. Across the world, different civilizations use different building materials, and those materials shape how cities are lost. Mud brick can erode into low mounds. Timber can disappear almost completely. Stone can endure for thousands of years. Adobe, rammed earth, plaster, and brick each leave different archaeological signatures. The material of a city does not simply determine how it looked when it was alive, it also determines how it will be remembered after abandonment. This means the visibility of a lost city is partly a matter of material culture. A city built mostly in perishable materials may be no less sophisticated than one built in stone. It may simply return to the earth more quickly. Roof beams rot, earthen walls soften in the rain, plaster flakes away. What remains may seem modest at first glance, yet it can still represent a complex and highly organized society. That is why some of the most elusive cities are also among the most important to study. Their scarcity of visible remains can make them easy to overlook. But that very disappearance can reveal something fundamental about adaptation, labor, and regional building traditions. To understand them, archaeologists often have to read subtle traces in soil color, debris layers, and low outlines barely raised above the landscape. Material choice also reflects local knowledge. Builders adapted to climate, available resources, and labor requirements. Mud brick was practical in some dry regions. Timber suited forested areas. Stone required more transport and shaping but offered greater durability. Each choice reveals a relationship with place. In a sense, the materials themselves are part of the city's conversation with its environment. The afterlife of materials matters too. Broken brick can be reused, fallen stone can be quarried, eroded walls can be leveled and rebuilt. Cities are not static monuments but recyclable systems. Their components move through time. A beam becomes fuel. Block becomes a foundation. A wall becomes fill. Human settlement is often less about permanence than about repeated reuse. Because of this, the act of finding a lost city often involves reading absence creatively. What once stood may now be soil discoloration, foundation marks, or a slight change in elevation. The city becomes almost like a memory impressed into the land. You do not always see a wall. Sometimes you see where the wall changed the earth. You do not always find a house. Sometimes you find the pattern left by a house's long disappearance. That quiet impression is enough to carry history forward, and as the night deepens, it is enough for us as well. We do not need every wall to stand. We only need to listen to what remains. Some lost cities become famous not because we know so much about them, but because we know so little. In that emptiness, imagination begins to work. Later generations often wrap ruins in stories of hidden wealth, vanished dynasties, cursed palaces, or secret survivors who carried the city's treasure away just in time. These tales can be colorful and enduring, and they often say as much about the storytellers as they do about the place itself. When the original context is forgotten, even a broken wall or a half-buried stairway can seem like the doorway to something immense. Treasure stories grow easily around ruins because a city once meant stores of grain, workshops, temple goods, jewelry, tools, and trade. The physical memory of abundance lingers long after the people are gone, yet the true value of such places is not gold, it is knowledge. Their streets, canals, houses, and cemeteries reveal how people organized food, labor, belief, family life, and authority. They show what was needed to make an urban world last, and what happened when that world could no longer hold together. In that sense, the fantasy of wealth is only a shadow cast by a deeper richness. Myths of hidden cities can still matter, even when they are not literally true. Human beings have always needed stories that give shape to absence. A city that vanished from maps but remained alive in memory becomes more than a ruin. It becomes a symbol of lost greatness, of justice deferred, of prosperity hidden somewhere beyond the horizon. Many traditions preserve the idea of a beautiful place still waiting to be found, whether beneath sand, behind mountains, or at the edge of the sea. These stories endure because they speak to longing. They preserve the feeling that the world once held something complete, and that completeness might somehow be glimpsed again. Folklore often keeps that emotional truth even when the details change. A city may be transformed into a legendary kingdom, a sacred refuge, or a place where bells can still be heard under the earth. Such images soften the hard fact of disappearance. They allow people to live with loss by turning it into wonder. And wonder, especially in the quiet hours, can be a gentle companion. Sometimes a city is not truly silent at all. It only becomes lost in the minds of later generations because its script is undeciphered, its language unfamiliar, or its records incomplete. When writing cannot be read, a city can seem as though it has no voice. Tablets, stelae, seals, and painted signs remain present, but their meaning stays locked away. That uncertainty gives a ruin an unusual stillness. It is physically there, yet intellectually closed. Decipherment changes everything. Once a script is understood, a city begins to speak across time. Names appear, offerings become legible. Tax lists, prayers, laws, and inventories emerge from what had seemed like silence. The process can feel almost like waking a sleeping voice very carefully so it does not vanish again. Often this happens gradually, through comparison with better-known languages, repeated symbols, or bilingual inscriptions that provide the needed key. Archaeology and philology work together here, patient and close to the ground. A single breakthrough can transform an entire civilization from mystery into texture and detail. The city did not change in the meantime, only our hearing improved. That is one of the quiet comforts of historical study. The past can wait. There have been many such moments in archaeology, when a site once thought obscure suddenly opened into clarity. A new inscription may connect a place to a known ruler. A better reading of a name may reveal trade links to distant regions. Improved dating methods can place buildings and burials into a more precise sequence, letting us see the city's life in stages rather than as a blur. Sometimes the first clue comes from an ordinary object, a potsherd, a seal impression, a fragment of wall plaster, a piece of bone with marks made by use. With enough patience, these small things begin to assemble a larger picture. The transformation is often less dramatic than it sounds, but it can feel profound. A silent ruin becomes populated again by questions, and then by answers. Even uncertainty becomes more useful once it has shape. Scholars learn to distinguish what is known from what is only probable, and what remains beautifully unresolved. This careful balance keeps archaeology honest. It does not force a city to be more definite than the evidence allows. Instead, it lets the site reveal itself in layers, the way dawn reveals a landscape slowly, without any sudden noise. One of the most peaceful ideas in the study of lost cities is that history is still there, even when it must wait a long time to be understood. A broken wall is not a finished sentence, but neither is it meaningless. A buried floor may preserve the trace of a hearth, the wear of footsteps, the pattern of a doorway used every day for years. Such traces are modest, yet they carry continuity. They remind us that human life left a mark, however faint. In the field, archaeologists often work with patience that borders on meditation. They clean, measure, record, and compare. They accept that significance may come from an accumulation of small details rather than from one grand discovery. For the rest of us, that can be a comforting thought. The past does not vanish just because it is temporarily unreadable. It rests. It waits under dust, soil, silt, or memory until someone is ready to listen. Some cities are lost not because they were destroyed, but because their populations moved away without total abandonment. The old center may no longer have been the best place to live. Water sources shifted, trade routes changed, political protection moved elsewhere. Fields around the city may have become less productive, or a newer settlement may have offered better access to roads and markets. In such cases, departure could be gradual rather than sudden. Families resettled nearby. Temples continued for a time. Workshops lingered. The old city grew quieter while life reorganized around it. This kind of transition can be harder to notice than dramatic ruin, but it is very common in urban history. A city may not die in one moment. It may simply become less useful, less central, less preferred. And yet its memory remains present in the people who came from it, in the old boundaries that still shape fields, and in the names that survive in local speech. The city does not vanish completely. It changes form. Sometimes the name itself moves with the community, attaching to a new location and keeping the old identity alive in a fresh setting. In that way, a lost city may survive by becoming another place. Archaeologists can often detect these gradual relocations in subtle layers. The pottery changes first, perhaps as people bring different traditions or acquire new trade goods. House foundations shift or new buildings overlap older ones at the edge of the settlement. Roads realign. Cemeteries move. Administrative structures appear in a nearby place while the old center becomes less crowded. None of this needs to happen in a single year. Sometimes centuries pass with only slight adjustments, each one small enough to seem ordinary, but over time the map changes entirely. What had once been the center becomes a memory of a center. This is one reason lost cities can feel so human. They mirror our own habits of moving on gradually, carrying part of the past with us while making room for what comes next. The old streets may still lie beneath grass or dust, but the life of the city has already found a new path. There are also cities that become lost because political borders change around them. A place once central to one kingdom may become peripheral under another. A capital may shift, a dynasty may fall, trade routes may reorient toward a different coast, river, or mountain pass. A city can remain physically intact while losing the administrative and symbolic weight that once sustained it. From the outside, this may seem like a small change in policy. In lived reality, it can alter everything. Officials leave, taxes are redirected, merchants follow opportunity. Temples receive less patronage, roads are neglected. The city is still there, but it no longer sits at the heart of power. Over time, this shifting importance can make a once famous place obscure. It may survive in chronicles, in border disputes, or in ritual memory, yet its name becomes less familiar to later generations. This is a reminder that urban importance is never permanent. It depends on decisions made elsewhere, on alliances, on geography, on the movement of armies and goods. Power is not fixed in stone. It moves, and cities rise or fade according to that movement. Even the most iconic ruins are usually only partial survivors. What remains above ground often favors the monumental and the durable. Stone temples, defensive walls, plazas, tombs, and monumental stairways. But the city that people lived in every day was far more varied. Wooden houses, markets made of perishable materials, workshops with earthen floors, kitchens, sheds, courtyards, and storage spaces may all disappear first. This can distort our understanding if we focus only on what endures best. A temple may dominate the landscape, but it does not tell the whole story of the city beneath it. The life of ordinary people often took place in the structures least likely to survive. For that reason, archaeologists try to look beyond the famous core. Surveys of suburbs, road systems, industrial zones, refused deposits, and peripheral neighborhoods can restore a more complete picture. The edges matter, the spaces between monuments matter. They reveal how the city functioned as a living system rather than as a collection of impressive stones. In these less visible areas, we find evidence of cooking, repair, trade, childcare, craft production, and daily movement. These are the rhythms that made the city real. That wider view also reveals social complexity. Lost cities were never inhabited by only rulers and priests, though those are often the people most visible in surviving records. They also held workers, migrants, servants, artisans, farmers, children, travelers, and strangers passing through. Different neighborhoods may have reflected different incomes, occupations, or ethnic traditions. Some people lived near markets, others near temples, others near gates or water sources. The city was a shared environment with many overlapping lives. Archaeology can recover some of this diversity through burials, tools, house plans, food remains, and worn objects that show use rather than display. Yet the evidence is uneven. The voices of the powerful often survive in writing. The quieter voices survive in fragments of daily life. A broken spindle whirl, a child's bead, a chipped cooking vessel, a patch of repaired wall, a pathway worn smooth by repeated feet. All of these can hint at ordinary existence. Reading for those quieter traces takes care and humility. It asks the scholar to look not only for grandeur, but for continuity, adaptation, and human habit. That attentiveness is one of the deepest disciplines in archaeology. It teaches patience with partial evidence and respect for what remains. A fragment is not a failure. It is a beginning. The work is often slow, and that slowness suits the subject. A city lost for centuries cannot be fully recovered in a day. Even when a site has been carefully excavated, interpretation continues. New questions arise, earlier conclusions are refined. The past remains partly open. This is not frustration alone. It is also a kind of gentleness. The evidence is allowed to stay imperfect. We do not force it to speak too loudly. We listen carefully to what it can tell us and leave room for silence where needed. In that way, the study of lost cities becomes an exercise in restraint as much as discovery. It models a quiet kind of attention that can be restful to imagine. And if a lost city seems to vanish again in the dark, that is all right. The mind has already held it long enough to know it was once real. That brief recognition is enough. When we think of lost cities, it is easy to imagine one dramatic ruin standing alone, as if history were a single collapse. But the deeper truth is more patient and more human. Cities are processes. They begin as settlements, grow into centers of exchange or ritual, expand outward, reorganize themselves, decline in some parts while flourishing in others, and sometimes reappear in changed forms at nearby sites or in later memory. They are not fixed objects. They are long negotiations between people and land, between water and stone, between need and ambition, between continuity and change. Streets are altered, districts are repurposed, sacred spaces are rebuilt, dwellings are abandoned and reused. Over many generations, a city can become almost unrecognizable to itself. That is not failure alone. It is the ordinary condition of urban life. People try to make places durable, but durability is always partial. Mortar cracks. Rivers shift, trees grow, soil rises, time covers what was once open. Seeing lost cities this way makes the subject less like a puzzle box and more like a study in endurance. Across the world, people have built places meant to last, and many of those efforts have left some trace. Some cities disappeared beneath sand, some were swallowed by forest, some sank into marsh or water, some were layered beneath later buildings. Some survive only in text, in maps, in oral tradition, or in fragments carried far from their original home. Each kind of loss tells a different story. A buried city speaks of landscape change. A submerged city speaks of rising water or shifting shorelines. A city preserved in documents speaks of memory without full visibility. Together, they show the variety of human settlement and the many ways a place can remain present after its daily life is gone. They also remind us that abandonment is not the same as erasure. A place may no longer be lived in, yet it can still shape local identity, sacred geography, or the work of scholarship. The past persists in fragments, and those fragments can be read with care. So as this quiet journey comes to a close, remember that every lost city was once a home, a workplace, a sacred place, and a map of human hope. Its silence is not empty. It holds the residue of footsteps, the echo of voices, the shape of rooms, and the long patience of stone beneath weather and dust. What survives may be incomplete, but it is enough to tell us that people were there, building, trading, praying, resting, and returning day after day. That is what makes these places so moving. They show us that human life leaves traces even when it passes out of sight. And now, as you rest, let the old streets fade slowly, like lanterns going out one by one, while the memory of them remains warm and still.